Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It all started with a question. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you're sure you're alone? I wasn't looking for anything unusual when I stumbled across the shelf. I had just moved into a small town and was trying to settle into my new life. The library was the only place I found some peace, a quiet sanctuary where time seemed to slow down. The smell of old paper and the creak of wooden shelves became familiar companions. But that day, as I walked down the narrow aisle, something caught my eye. At first, it was just the odd way the shelf was tucked away behind a row of books. It was slightly hidden, as though it didn't belong there. When I stepped closer, I realized the books on it weren't listed in any of the library's catalogs. Strange. How could something so present, so real, be missing from the records? There were no titles on the spines, just blank covers. A few of them had faint markings, but nothing I could decipher. I hesitated for a moment, the eerie silence of the library pressing in on me. It felt almost like the room itself was holding its breath. Something about the shelf seemed off. Curiosity got the better of me, as it often does. I pulled the first book from the shelf, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was an odd texture, not like any book I had touched before. The pages were yellowed, but they were smooth, like a well-worn stone. There was no title, but the pages called to me. I opened the first page, unsure of what to expect. The words on the page began to pull me in, as if they were more than just ink on paper. They felt alive. The characters seemed to whisper to me, the descriptions growing vivid with each line. It wasn't just reading, it was something else. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in the air. A coldness. I looked around, but the library remained as still as ever. The light from the windows flickered for a second, and I could have sworn I saw a shadow dart across the room. My heart skipped a beat, but I dismissed it as nothing. I returned my focus to the book. I continued reading. The words seemed to blend with the reality around me, pulling me deeper into the story. I was no longer just reading about characters in some far-off place. I was there with them, experiencing their world. The words on the page described places I recognized, but there was something different about them, something unsettling. At first, it was subtle. The rustling of pages seemed to echo louder than before. The air felt heavier, like the room was growing smaller. A faint sound, like footsteps, echoed in the distance. But I told myself it was just my imagination. Then the details started to change. The story in the book wasn't just about places I knew, it started to describe me. My appearance, my thoughts, the very room I was sitting in. I froze. The words became clearer, more insistent, as though they were no longer coming from the page but from something or someone else. And the footsteps, they weren't imaginary. I could hear them now, coming closer, closer. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. My breath came in short gasps. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. The library was quiet again, too quiet. I returned the book to the shelf, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had followed me out of the pages and into the room. Or was it always there, waiting for me to notice? I hurried out of the library, but the unease stayed with me. The question lingered in my mind: what had I just experienced? And more importantly, what else was in those books? Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The shelf was waiting, and its stories weren't finished with me yet. I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the book, its pages turning, its words curling around my thoughts. The library felt closer to me now, almost like a magnet pulling me back. I tried to push it aside, to live a normal day, but it wasn't working. There was something wrong. A sense of being followed, watched. The next morning, after a restless night, I found myself at the library again. I don't know why I returned. I should have stayed away, but something about that shelf, those books, was calling me. Maybe I needed to understand what was happening, what I had experienced. I walked through the doors, the familiar musty scent of books greeting me. The soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed too loud in the silence. The library had always been a place of calm, but now it felt different. The quiet was almost suffocating. I headed straight for the aisle where I'd found the shelf, half expecting it to be gone. But no, it was still there, tucked away, as if it had never left. The books remained untouched, their blank spines waiting for someone to reach for them. I picked up another one, my hands trembling just slightly. The coldness from yesterday had returned. When I opened the book, the words leaped off the page immediately, as if they recognized me. They were the same as before, but they felt darker this time. The story described a place I didn't know, but the more I read, the more I recognized its details: the crumbling walls, the damp floors, the air heavy with the smell of mildew. It was all too familiar. It was the library itself, but twisted, warped. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in front of me. I looked up from the book, heart pounding, but the library was still as it had always been. The cold seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if the building had become a living thing, breathing in sync with the story. A faint sound echoed through the aisles, a scraping noise, like fingernails running down a chalkboard. I froze. The sound seemed to be coming from behind me. I slowly turned, but no one was there. Yet the noise persisted, closer now, as though something was moving in the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. I stepped away from the shelf, trying to ignore the fear creeping up my spine. It was the book. It had to be. The more I read, the more real the things from this story became. I dropped the book, and it fell with a thud. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the floor, too afraid to move. Then I heard it, footsteps. Soft, measured, as if someone, or something, was approaching me slowly, deliberately. I couldn't see it, but I felt its presence. The room seemed to contract, the air thickening, pressing in on me. The footsteps grew louder, and with them, an eerie whisper filled the space, calling my name. Come closer. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. Just the cold, empty aisles. I ran, faster than I thought possible, until I reached the exit. The library doors slammed behind me, and I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. But even then, the coldness followed me, lingering at the edge of my senses. The book, the words, the shelf, they weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real, and whatever was in those pages had begun to leak into the world around me. I tried to convince myself it was just fear, that I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was changing. and I couldn't outrun it. The shadow was already here, waiting. The days that followed were strange, each one blurring into the next. I tried to go on with my life, pretending nothing had changed. But the library, those books, haunted my thoughts constantly. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was always lurking in the corner of my vision, just out of reach, waiting. The shadows were the worst part. It wasn't just the dim corners of my apartment or the alleyways outside. No, this was different. It was the way the shadows moved, as if they were alive, stretching and pulling in unnatural directions. Even when I wasn't near the library, they followed me. I would walk down the street, and for a split second, the shadow of a lamppost would stretch out too long, like a hand reaching for me. I'd turn to look, but it was always gone by the time my eyes locked onto it. I began to question if I was going mad. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress, the isolation, the constant fear of being alone. But the whispers persisted. Faint at first, just out of earshot, but they were there, calling my name in that soft, eerie tone. They came at night, when the wind howled through the cracks of my apartment, carrying with it the faintest sound of footsteps. My heart would race, my pulse quicken, and I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, frozen. Then, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back to the library. I had to understand what was happening. I needed answers, and I knew the only place to find them was in those books. I walked through the familiar, heavy doors, and the coldness hit me immediately. It was as if the building itself was aware of my return, waiting for me to step inside. The library was empty, just the way it had been the last time I visited. But this time, there was no doubt in my mind that something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick with an almost tangible tension. I moved to the shelf, my fingers trembling as I reached for another book. The title was unfamiliar, but I didn't need to read it. The moment I touched the cover, I felt the rush of something dark and heavy swirling around me. The book opened on its own, the pages flipping rapidly, as though it were searching for something. My eyes were glued to the words, unable to look away. They began to describe the library in more detail, each passage more vivid, more real than the last. The aisles, the shelves, the worn steps that led to the upper floors, everything was there, every detail, but distorted. The descriptions were twisted, as if the library was alive, its walls shifting, its floors groaning with ancient hunger. And then, the figure appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, lurking at the edge of the aisle, its form indistinct. But as I read on, it became clearer, tall, dark, with long, spindly limbs. Its eyes glowed faintly, though I could never quite make out their true color. It was watching me. No, it wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for me. The air around me grew colder, and the faint scent of mildew became stronger. The room seemed to shift, its corners growing darker as the figure took a step toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to step back, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. I could hear my name, clear as day. They weren't coming from the book anymore, they were coming from the shadows. Come closer. I closed the book with a snap, the sound echoing too loudly in the silence. But it didn't matter. The figure was already closer, its presence undeniable, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I could feel it, behind me, in front of me, closing in from every angle. I turned around, but there was no escaping it. The figure was there, standing just a few feet away. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt something in me shift. A sudden wave of terror mixed with something deeper, something familiar. I knew it. I had seen those eyes before. But where? My mind was racing, trying to grasp at any memory, any clue, but the figure took another step forward. It was too close now. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The library around me began to blur, the shelves warping, the walls bending, and the shadows were alive, reaching for me. And then, in the thick of it all, I understood. The figure wasn't just a part of the book. It wasn't a creature from a story, it was me. The description had shifted again, and now the words in the book didn't just describe the library, they described me, standing there, frozen, terrified. I had become a part of it, a part of the story. And now, the figure was my reflection, twisted and distorted, waiting to consume me. "Come closer," it whispered again, and this time, I couldn't resist. I felt it before I saw it, the pull, as if the air itself was thickening around me, squeezing my chest. I could feel the weight of the figure, its presence pressing against my skin, suffocating me. The glowing eyes were the only thing I could focus on, the only thing that seemed real. Every part of me screamed to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, caught in its gaze, unable to look away. The whispers grew louder. They echoed in my mind, not just my ears. It was as though they were crawling under my skin, burrowing into my thoughts. "Come closer." It wasn't just the figure speaking anymore. The shadows were talking, too. They were alive now, twisting around the room, stretching toward me like dark fingers reaching for my very soul. They called to me, beckoning, urging me forward. I could feel the coldness wrapping around me, growing deeper, gnawing at my bones. The words in the book had stopped being just words. They were real, shaping the world around me, bending it into something I couldn't comprehend. I was trapped inside the story. And the worst part was, I was beginning to accept it. The figure stepped closer. Its shape was now undeniable, its body impossibly tall and thin, its long limbs twisting unnaturally as it moved. The air grew so cold I could see my breath in front of me, swirling in the dim light. The whispers were almost deafening, urging me to make a choice. A choice. My mind scrambled for a way out, but every direction led back to the same thing, the figure, the shadow, the book. There was no escaping this. The story had me in its grip, and I was no longer sure if I was the reader or the character. I had become part of the narrative, and it was closing in on me. I glanced down at the book still in my hands, the pages flipping on their own. The words were describing the figure in vivid detail, its movements, its intentions, its hunger. But there was something else. Amid the chaos of the description, there was a phrase that stood out, buried in the middle of the page. "You have the power to choose." I froze. The power to choose? Was it speaking to me, or was it part of the narrative? The words seemed to pulse, as if alive, waiting for me to understand. I looked up at the figure, its eyes burning into mine, a twisted reflection of my own fear. The whispering voices continued to call me forward, but now something had changed. I felt a shift in my mind, a flicker of defiance, as though I was no longer just part of the story, but had become something more. The book wasn't controlling me. I was controlling it. I slammed the book shut with all the strength I could muster. The action sent a sharp, crackling sound through the air. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The whispers ceased. The figure stopped moving. But only for a moment. Then, everything exploded. The walls of the library began to tremble, the shelves rattling as if the building itself was coming apart. The ground beneath me shook, and I felt the weight of the shadows pressing in, threatening to swallow me whole. The figure advanced again, its glowing eyes now a blinding light, its shape twisting and contorting in ways that defied reality. You cannot escape. You are part of the story now. The words in my head weren't just words anymore. They were a command, a decree. I could feel the reality around me warping, bending, pulling me in, swallowing me whole. But as the shadows reached for me, I understood something. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a battle for my own existence. I had to make a choice. I could either be consumed by the darkness, become another part of the story, or I could fight back. But how? How could I fight against something that was written into existence? How could I fight against the very words that had brought me here? I had to believe there was something more, something beyond the words. A way out. With trembling hands, I opened the book once more. But this time, I didn't let the words pull me in. I didn't let the story control me. Instead, I focused on the page, on the blank spaces between the lines, on the silence that existed beyond the narrative. I pushed, harder than I ever had before, forcing my will into the story. And slowly, painfully, the room began to shift. The figure faltered. The shadows receded. The power of the story, the words that had consumed everything, began to unravel. The figure's form wavered, its eyes flickering as if it were losing its grip on the world. The book in my hands started to glow, the pages burning with light as though they were rejecting the darkness that had invaded them. It wasn't over yet. I knew that. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was in control. The words on the page weren't just a story. They were mine to command. And as the library began to collapse around me, I made my choice. I closed the book, and everything went dark. I woke up on the cold, stone floor of the library, the dim light of morning filtering through the high windows. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented, unsure of what had just happened. The silence was deafening, but somehow it felt different. Softer. Less oppressive. I stood up slowly, my body aching as though I had been through some great ordeal. The shelves were still there, the books still lined up in neat rows. But there was no shadow now, no figure watching me from the corners. The whispers had stopped. I glanced at the shelf where it all began, the shelf with the books that shouldn't exist. But when I reached for it, I hesitated. The power, the pull, was gone. The books were just books again, nothing more. But even as I left the library that day, something stayed with me. A quiet feeling, a lingering question. What if the story hadn't ended? What if the books were still waiting for someone else to open them? I could feel it, just beyond the edge of my thoughts. The story wasn't finished. It couldn't be. And somewhere, hidden in the pages of the books that didn't exist, the shadow was still watching, waiting for its next reader. It wasn't over. Not yet. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you could listen to the thoughts of others? What if you could hear secrets, hidden truths no one was willing to share? I didn't expect to find out, but that was before I bought the old recorder. It was an ordinary Thursday, or at least, it seemed ordinary. The kind of day that doesn't stick in your memory, a day like any other. But that's why I found it. A dusty old shop at the end of the street, tucked between two newer, brighter storefronts. The window was cluttered with old junk, but something in there caught my eye. A silver recorder, worn and scratched, sat in the corner of the display. It wasn't new, not by a long shot. But there was something about it that intrigued me. The owner of the shop, an old man with gray hair and a crooked smile, seemed eager to sell it to me. "It's a special one," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not like the others. You'll see." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't care. It was cheap, and I figured I could use it for my voice memos, something to help me organize my thoughts. I handed him the cash and walked out, the recorder tucked under my arm. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the recorder in my hands. I pressed the button to start recording, expecting nothing more than a simple device. But something felt different when I listened to the static, the hum of the machine. It was as though the recorder had a presence, as though it was listening to me, not the other way around. I started speaking into it, casually. "Just bought this recorder today. Not sure why, but it felt right." I didn't think much of it. At first, it was just my voice, a steady stream of thoughts, random ramblings. But then, after a few minutes, something strange happened. A soft crackle came through the speaker. I thought it was interference at first, but it grew louder. Then, I heard it, a voice. A voice that wasn't mine. I paused. I couldn't believe it. I rewound the tape and listened again. There it was, clear as day. He doesn't even know, does he? So naive. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the recorder. No one was in the room with me. I hadn't spoken those words. In fact, I hadn't even thought them. I sat frozen for a moment, my hand gripping the recorder. Then I played it again. "You'll regret this. You'll see." The voice was colder now, tinged with something I couldn't place. Disdain? Warning? I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore it. Who was speaking? And why? I rewound the tape again. This time, I was more cautious. I hit play, but the voice wasn't the only thing I heard. In the background, there was a faint rustling, like paper shifting, and then footsteps. He'll never make it through the night. Not with what he's done. My blood ran cold. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No one else had been in my apartment. No one could have been speaking into the recorder. And yet, there it was, this voice, describing things it shouldn't have known. Who were these people? Why were they speaking about me? What did they mean by what he's done? I couldn't stop myself. I rewound the tape one last time, eager for answers. But as I did, the recorder started to hum again, louder this time. Almost as though it were alive. I couldn't make sense of it. The voice on the tape seemed to recognize my fear. It seemed to feed off it. He's listening now. He's heard us. I froze. The voice sounded different this time, closer. It was as though whoever was speaking was right next to me. It wasn't just a voice on a recording anymore. It felt real. The voice was now speaking directly to me. "You've made a mistake, haven't you? You shouldn't have listened. Now you'll never be able to escape." I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't understand. What mistake had I made? What was happening? The room around me seemed to grow colder, the air thick with something unexplainable. The walls closed in, the shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. The more I listened, the more I felt a presence growing around me. The recorder, it wasn't just a device anymore. It had become a doorway, a gateway to something I couldn't see but could certainly feel. Something was watching me. It's too late for you. You've hurt us, and now you're ours. I slammed the recorder down, trying to break the connection, but the voices didn't stop. They continued, reverberating through my mind even after I turned off the machine. I could hear them, muffled but still there, whispering in the dark. I was no longer alone in my apartment. The voices surrounded me, seeping into the walls, into my thoughts. I tried to leave, to escape, but every step I took felt heavier. The apartment felt suffocating now, as though it were closing in on me. The voices grew louder, more frantic. We'll never let you go. You'll never be free again. It wasn't just the voices on the recorder anymore. They were in the room with me. They were in my head. Listen to us. You should have never bought the recorder. You've unlocked something you can't control. I stumbled towards the door, but it wouldn't open. The lock had jammed. My fingers trembled as I pulled at the handle, my heart pounding. The air was thick with the oppressive presence of the voices. They were everywhere. They knew everything. You'll hear us forever. And then I heard it, footsteps. Not on the recording, but in my apartment. Clear, deliberate steps. I whipped around, expecting to see someone. But there was no one. I wasn't alone anymore. The voices knew my secrets. And now they were here to claim me. The night dragged on in an endless loop of whispers, footsteps, and chilling laughter. The recorder was still on the table, its tape still spinning, though I hadn't touched it in what felt like hours. Every time I looked at it, I felt a pull, a gravitational force that urged me to press play, to hear more. But I couldn't. I was terrified of what I might hear next. The voices had started to change. They weren't just speaking to me anymore. They were speaking about me. About my past. About things I had long forgotten, things I had buried deep inside. He thinks he can outrun us. But he can't. We know everything. I could feel them, those voices, swirling around me, pressing in from all sides. They weren't just sounds. They were thoughts, impressions, memories that didn't belong to me. They were reaching into my mind, pulling out the darkest parts of me, the secrets I had hidden away. They knew things I had never told anyone. Secrets that no one should know. And yet, they spoke of them as if they were old friends, as though they had always been there, lurking in the dark corners of my mind. The lies you've told, the things you've done, we know it all. I shuddered, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every corner seemed to hide something. Something watching. Waiting. I could hear the whispers growing louder. He can't hide from us. We're always listening. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself that I was just imagining it. That it was all in my head. But I couldn't. The voices were real. And they were getting closer. I couldn't escape. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to block out the voices, they only grew louder. The air felt heavier with every passing minute, as though the very atmosphere was being weighed down by their presence. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and the walls seemed to close in on me, inch by inch. I tried everything I could think of, turning off the recorder, throwing it in the closet, even smashing it against the floor in a desperate attempt to silence them. But it was no use. The voices continued, as if they were woven into the very fabric of reality, slipping through cracks in the walls and seeping into my thoughts. He's losing control. We're inside his mind now, I gasped, my hands trembling. It was as though they were right next to me, breathing down my neck. I could feel their cold fingers brushing against the back of my skull, tugging at my thoughts. Every word they spoke felt like a weight pressing on my chest. I stumbled towards the window, hoping that some fresh air would clear my head. I opened it wide, letting the night breeze rush in. But instead of relief, the wind brought with it a chilling cold, colder than it should have been for a late summer evening. I turned around, my eyes darting across the room, trying to find the source of the cold. "You can't run from us." The voice was right behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. No one. I was alone. But I wasn't. I could feel them, the voices, pressing in on me from all sides. I was suffocating. I grabbed my head, my fingers digging into my temples, trying to block out their whispers. But they kept coming, each word more insistent, more urgent than the last. "He doesn't understand." He never did. The recorder, lying discarded on the table, began to hum. Slowly at first, then louder and louder until the sound reverberated through the room. It was like a heartbeat, pounding, vibrating the very air around me. I didn't know what to do anymore. The voices had already seeped into my mind, into my very thoughts. Every moment, they grew more real, more present. I could see them now, shadowy figures, half-formed, like the ghosts of my own mind, watching me from the corners of the room. "We've been with you all along." The words sent a shock through my spine. They knew me. They knew everything about me, my fears, my regrets, the darkest parts of my past. They knew things that I had never told anyone, things that no one should know. And they were using those secrets against me. I could feel them, like invisible fingers, wrapping around my mind, tightening their grip. "You've always known, haven't you? You've always known we were here." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The weight of the voices was too much, crushing me from all sides. I staggered back, my legs giving way beneath me as I collapsed to the floor. The room was spinning, the shadows closing in tighter. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The voices had found me. They had taken root in my mind, in my very soul. "You can't outrun what's inside you." The words echoed in my head, over and over, each repetition growing louder, more desperate. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to make it stop. But how? In that moment of madness, I grabbed the recorder again, this time with a new resolve. I didn't know if it would help, but I had to try. I pressed the record button, my fingers shaking as I held it down. The voices stopped. Just like that. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, through the silence, came the softest whisper. "You've made a mistake." I froze. It wasn't just on the recorder anymore. The voice was in the room with me. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, coalescing into darker shapes, as if they were waiting for me to make the next move. I looked down at the recorder, the one I had thought would offer some kind of escape. But the faces on the screen, they weren't just voices anymore. They were faces, indistinct but unmistakably human, pressing up against the surface, their eyes wide open, their mouths moving as if they were trying to speak. "It's too late now. We've already found you." I slammed the recorder to the ground. I was done. I couldn't take it any longer. But as it shattered into pieces, the silence returned, only it wasn't the same silence as before. It was heavy, suffocating. And I could still feel them, watching, waiting. The darkness was now inside me. I couldn't tell if it was the recorder that had cursed me, or if it was something else, something older, something that had been buried inside of me for far longer than I cared to admit. But ever since that night, the voices hadn't stopped. They were inside my head now, part of my thoughts, always whispering in the back of my mind. You can't get rid of us. We know everything. The truth was, I didn't know if I ever would. I had tried everything, seeing therapists, staying in different places, even moving to another city. But it didn't matter. The voices followed me. They were everywhere, always close. And now, the shadows weren't just whispers. They were real. I could see them in the corners of my vision, flickering at the edge of my perception. Dark shapes, twisting, reaching out for me. I could feel them pulling at my mind, tearing it apart. No matter where I went, they were there. You can't escape. You belong to us now. I started losing track of time. Days bled into each other. It felt like I had been running for so long, but I didn't know what I was running from anymore. The recorder was gone, shattered beyond repair, but the voices, they were still with me. And every day, I felt their presence more strongly. I didn't know how long I could last. But I knew one thing for certain, I had become part of the story now. And there was no going back. I stopped running. There was nowhere left to hide. The voices had consumed everything, the space around me, the silence, my thoughts. The shadows that once flickered at the edge of my vision were no longer just illusions. They were real. They were everywhere. I couldn't tell where I ended and they began. The apartment I had been trying to escape felt like a tomb. Every corner was filled with their presence. Every room was suffocating, each breath heavier than the last. The voices no longer whispered. They shouted. They screamed. It was as though they were no longer speaking from a recording, but from deep within my own mind. And they were angry. You can't hide from us now. We own you. I was no longer sure if they were even separate from me anymore. The lines between us had blurred so completely that I didn't know if they had always been here or if I had become part of something darker. Something older. I tried to remember what life had been like before all of this, before the recorder, before the voices. But the memories seemed distant now, fading like old photographs. I couldn't trust my own thoughts. The voices had twisted everything. They knew everything about me, my past, my regrets, my fears. They used them against me, like weapons, tearing me apart from the inside. I went to the kitchen, almost mechanically. I didn't know why I was moving, just that my body was carrying me forward, as if on autopilot. But as I stepped into the room, I froze. The refrigerator door was open, and something was inside. I approached slowly, my heart thudding in my chest, every nerve on edge. There was no rational reason to be scared, but the voices kept pushing against me, louder and louder. You're too late. We've already won. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I pulled it open. Inside, nestled among the everyday groceries, was something that shouldn't have been there. A recorder. The same one. It wasn't broken this time. It was intact. I stared at it, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the cold metal sending a shiver down my spine. There was no way. I had destroyed it. I had broken it into pieces. And yet here it was, as if it had never been touched, as if it had never been shattered. You think you can escape? You belong to us now. The voice came from the recorder. But it wasn't just from the recorder. It was inside me, in my head, in my bones. It was everywhere. I hit the record button, without thinking, without hesitation. The hum of the tape began to rise again, that familiar sound that had been haunting me for so long. But this time, something was different. This time, the voices didn't sound distant or separate. They were in my head, in my body, in my soul. They were me. It's too late. You've already heard us. You're ours now. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The recorder, the thing that had started all of this, had become my prison. The voices had twisted me into something else, something I didn't recognize. I had become part of them, and they were part of me. I couldn't remember who I had been before the recorder. I didn't even know if I was the same person anymore. The recorder began to speak again. But this time, the voice was not unfamiliar. You've always known us. You've always been one of us. I tried to scream, to fight back, but it was useless. The recorder was no longer a device. It was an extension of myself. The voices, the shadows, they weren't outside of me anymore. They had become me. And as I stood there, frozen in place, I realized the truth. The recorder hadn't unlocked some hidden power. It hadn't opened a door to another world. It had shown me the truth that had always been there. The voices, the shadows, the fear, it had all been inside me from the beginning. I wasn't being haunted by something outside. I was being haunted by myself. There's nowhere to run. You belong to us. The recorder clicked off, and the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence. It was deafening, suffocating. I was no longer just hearing the voices. I had become them. I had been part of the story all along, and there was no escape. Have you ever found something that made you question everything you knew about time? That's what happened to me, and the more I tried to understand it, the more I realized I never really could. It was just a regular day when I came across the box. I didn't think much of it at first, just a simple, dusty wooden box tucked away in the back of a second-hand shop. The price tag was almost comically low, but there was something about it that caught my attention. It wasn't the craftsmanship or the odd carvings on its surface. No, it was the way it seemed to pulse ever so slightly as if it were alive. I bought it on a whim, thinking it would be a good addition to my small collection of curiosities. Little did I know that I had just invited something strange into my life. That night, I placed the box on my desk, feeling a strange pull toward it even as I set it down. It looked ordinary, just an old box, but something about it felt wrong. There was an energy in the air, a faint static charge I couldn't explain. As evening descended into night, I found myself inexplicably drawn to the box. The clock had barely ticked past midnight when I opened it, driven by an overwhelming compulsion. What I saw inside, well, it didn't make sense. There were old, yellowed photographs that I didn't recognize. The people in them were strangers, yet there was something oddly familiar about their expressions, their eyes. They were looking at me. But how could that be? I hadn't seen any of them before in my life. Alongside the photos, there were notes, handwritten, in a language I couldn't decipher, yet the handwriting felt eerily like my own. And then, there was an object I couldn't place, a small, metallic device, shaped like a compass but with strange, unfamiliar markings etched into it. At first, I thought I had fallen asleep and was dreaming. I closed the box, rubbed my eyes, and tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease. But when I opened it again, everything had changed. The photographs were different now, new faces staring back at me. Some were even in color, vivid, sharp. The notes, they were in a language I could understand now. They were talking about me, describing things I hadn't done yet. They spoke of decisions I hadn't made, of events I couldn't have known about. And the device, the strange metallic object, was now pulsing faintly, glowing with an unnatural light. I slammed the box shut, my heart racing. The room seemed to close in on me. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if time itself was pressing against me, bending in strange, inexplicable ways. My mind was racing. What was happening? How could these things be in the box? How could they be part of my reality? I didn't want to touch it again, but I couldn't resist. The curiosity, the need to understand, it was overwhelming. The next day, I returned to the box, my hand shaking as I lifted the lid. This time, it wasn't just photographs or notes. There was something far more sinister inside. A single letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was mine. But it wasn't a letter I had written. You're beginning to understand. The box is a window, a doorway between times. There is more to come. The words felt like a punch to the gut. I hadn't written this. It was as though someone, or something, had taken my own words and sent them back to me from a future I hadn't yet lived. My head spun. The room felt colder, and outside, the world seemed to blur and shift in a way that made it feel as though I were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. I tried to push the box away, but the pull was too strong. I could feel it calling to me, a quiet hum that resonated through my bones. I opened it again, this time with dread in my chest. The contents had changed once more. Now, there were items that didn't belong to me, things I couldn't explain. Old watches, a faded newspaper from the future, and a strange device that seemed to be from another era, sleek and metallic, with a faint light flickering on its surface. I turned it over in my hands, feeling a chill as I did. The markings on it seemed to shift as if they were not quite fixed in place. I couldn't breathe. I could hear the clock ticking in the background, its rhythm almost mocking in its normality. And yet, nothing around me felt normal anymore. The box had done something. It had opened a door to something that should not exist. Each time I opened it, I saw things from different times, things from the past, the present, and the future. But with each new item, the sense of dread grew. I began to realize that the box wasn't just showing me pieces of time, it was pulling me into it. Into the past, into the future, into places and events that I couldn't control. Things I hadn't lived yet, things that hadn't happened. The box was playing with time in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. And I could feel it, feel the box changing me. Its influence was seeping into my mind, blurring the line between what was real and what wasn't. What would happen if I opened it tomorrow? Would it show me my own death? Or worse, would it show me something far worse? The box wasn't just a box anymore. It was a key to something far greater and much darker than I could have ever imagined. And every time I opened it, I was one step closer to unlocking something I might not be able to survive. The more I opened the box, the more it seemed to consume me. It wasn't just a container for strange objects and photos, it was a doorway to something much larger, a force that I couldn't control. Each time I touched it, time itself seemed to bend. The world around me grew less familiar, more distorted. At first, the changes were subtle, a shadow here, a flicker there, but soon, the alterations were undeniable. One evening, as I opened the box, a sharp, bitter wind swept through the room. It wasn't coming from the open window. The air inside was thick, charged. My breath came out in visible puffs, like winter had descended upon me in a single instant. I could hear the faintest hum, like 1,000 voices whispering from far away. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Inside the box this time were 2 items, a photograph of me as a child, something I had never seen before, and a small notebook. The photograph showed me standing in a garden, laughing with my parents. It was from a time I didn't remember, from a place I couldn't recognize. I never had parents like that. Never had a garden like that. The notebook was unsettling in its simplicity. Its pages were filled with my own handwriting, though I had never written a single word in it. It was as if someone had taken my thoughts, my memories, and transcribed them into this book. Tomorrow, you will see the man in the coat. I shut the book quickly, my hands trembling. The wind around me howled louder, pressing against the walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move just beyond the edge of my vision, a figure in a long coat, standing in the corner of my room. But when I blinked, it was gone. That was when I realized the box didn't just hold things from other times, it was rewriting the fabric of my own life. The line between what I had lived and what was yet to come was fading. I couldn't separate my past from my future anymore. And I couldn't trust anything I saw. The next day, just as the notebook had predicted, I saw the man in the coat. I was walking down the street, my mind still heavy with the unsettling discoveries from the night before, when I noticed him standing across the road in the shadow of an old brick building. He was tall, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, but there was something about the way he stood that made my heart race. The world seemed to go still around him. People continued to move, but it felt like they were walking through water, slow and distorted. My feet were frozen to the ground. I couldn't look away. And then, just as suddenly as I had noticed him, he vanished. I should have run. I should have turned and gotten as far away from him as possible. But something stopped me. I had to know more. That evening, I opened the box again. The photograph and the notebook were gone, replaced with a key. It was old, rusted, but it seemed familiar, too familiar. My pulse quickened as I turned it over in my hands. There was a small inscription on it, one I couldn't quite make out at first. The door will open when you are ready. The key didn't make sense. I had never seen it before, but I knew it had a purpose. A deep, primal instinct told me it was meant to unlock something that was waiting for me. As the days passed, I grew more and more obsessed with the box. Every night, I would open it, hoping to find some clue, some answer. But all I found were new items, new pieces of time, of my life, that shouldn't have been there. And each time, the atmosphere around me shifted. The sounds of the world became distorted. Conversations grew muffled. The streetlights outside flickered, as if they were struggling to stay on. People began to look at me strangely, as if they knew I was no longer the same. Then, one night, I opened the box and found a map. The map was crumpled, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. It was a map of the city, but it was different. There were places marked that didn't exist, streets that weren't there. And there, at the very center, was a large X, right in the middle of a park I had passed through 1,000 times. I couldn't resist. The pull of the box had become unbearable. I had to see what was at that spot. At midnight, I went to the park. The air was thick with fog, the trees looming like dark, twisted shadows. As I walked deeper into the park, the world around me seemed to change. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The trees seemed to whisper, and the ground beneath my feet felt uneven, as though the earth itself was shifting. I reached the spot marked on the map, and my heart nearly stopped. In the middle of the park was an old, rusted door. It stood by itself, with no wall, no structure around it. Just a door, standing in the middle of nowhere. The key from the box seemed to burn in my pocket, calling to me. I took it out, my hands trembling as I inserted it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click, and the door creaked open. Behind it was a room. Not just any room. A room that didn't belong. The air inside was cold, too cold, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. The floor was covered in dust, and in the center of the room was a pedestal. Upon it rested an object, something I had seen before. Something from the box. It was the same metallic device I had found days before. The compass-like device with the strange markings. It hummed in my hands as I picked it up, its cold surface pressing against my skin. And as I held it, everything around me began to twist. The room began to warp, shifting and contorting as if it were being pulled by some unseen force. The door behind me slammed shut. My breath caught in my throat. The walls began to close in. I had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I was no longer sure if I was in the present, or if I was somewhere else, somewhere outside of time. The box had opened a door, and now I was trapped inside it. The room was no longer a room. It was a living thing, pulsating, breathing. The walls seemed to ripple like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. The symbols that covered them glowed faintly, their light shifting in response to my every movement. The floor beneath my feet felt soft, almost like sand, and with each step, it seemed to give way just slightly, as if the entire space was unstable, a construct barely held together by some unseen force. I reached for the door, but it was gone. In its place was an endless expanse of shadow, swallowing up the edges of the room. The only sound was the steady hum of the metallic device in my hand, vibrating with an energy that felt both foreign and familiar. A cold wind blew through the room, though there were no windows, no open spaces. The air was thick with a presence I couldn't quite define, something ancient, something watching. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, as if the very act of vocalizing had become impossible. My mouth moved, but no sound escaped. It felt like the air itself was pressing in on me, suffocating me from all sides. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were just a faint murmur, like the rustling of leaves in a breeze. But they grew louder, clearer, until they became voices, voices I knew. "You should never have opened it," a voice hissed. It was my own voice, but it was distorted, twisted, as if it was being filtered through some unnatural distortion. "You've gone too far," another voice said, softer now, almost a whisper of regret. It was also mine, but filled with an emotion I couldn't place. "It's too late for you," a third voice cut through the others, harsh and cold. The voice was unfamiliar, yet its tone felt oddly close to me. I dropped to my knees, my hand gripping the device tightly as it vibrated harder. The voices multiplied, filling the air with an endless chorus of words I couldn't comprehend. I forced myself to stand, despite the overwhelming weight of fear pressing down on me. I needed to find a way out. I had to escape. But every direction I turned, the room seemed to shift and warp, becoming more alien, more alienating. It wasn't just the space that was changing, it was me. The longer I stayed here, the less I recognized myself. The world outside, my reality, seemed to slip farther and farther away. The box had already rewritten so much, and I was afraid that soon it would erase me completely. The device in my hand began to glow, brighter and brighter, its hum growing louder until it became a deafening roar. I couldn't hold onto it anymore. It slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor, landing with a sharp, echoing clang. Everything went silent. The hum ceased. The walls stopped shifting. The shadows in the room stilled, and for a moment everything was normal. But it was a false peace. I could feel it in my bones, in the air. It was only a brief lull before the storm, a moment of quiet before the next shift. Suddenly, the door reappeared. But this time, it wasn't the same door. It was different. The edges of the doorframe were jagged, the wood splintered, as if it had been torn open by some unseen hand. I couldn't see what lay beyond it. The shadows were so deep, so thick, that they seemed to reach out like tendrils, pulling at my mind. I knew I had no choice but to go through. The moment I stepped toward the door, the room shifted again, faster now. The floor twisted beneath my feet, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I was no longer sure what was real. The door beckoned like a promise of escape, but I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing against me. I stepped through. The world outside the door was not my own. I was standing in a different place, a different time. I could tell because the buildings around me were ancient, crumbling under the weight of centuries. The streets were empty, save for the faint echoes of footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I was no longer in the city I knew. I didn't recognize anything. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of decay and something darker, something sinister. The sky above was swirling, a maelstrom of colors I had never seen before, like the universe itself was unraveling. The shadows in this world weren't like the ones in mine. They were solid, like living things, reaching out, stretching toward me. They seemed to follow me, moving as if they had a mind of their own. I began to walk, though I wasn't sure why. Something deep inside me told me to keep moving, to find the answers I needed, to understand what had happened. I passed a building with broken windows, and inside I saw strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols I had seen before, back in the room with the box. And then, I saw him. The man in the coat. The one who had been following me, whose presence had haunted me. He stood at the end of the street, watching me with eyes that I could feel even from a distance. He didn't move, but I knew he was aware of me. He knew I was here. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, I saw others. Figures, indistinct at first, but slowly becoming more clear. They were like him, tall, dark, and cloaked, their faces obscured by shadows. They were watching me too. I had walked into something I didn't understand, something far bigger than I had ever imagined. I had opened the door, and now I was part of whatever was waiting on the other side. But I wasn't sure if I could ever go back. I tried to turn back, but the street behind me had vanished. The building I had passed moments ago was now nothing but a blur in the distance, shrouded in shadows that moved like liquid. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, a road that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. My feet moved instinctively, as though something beyond me was guiding my every step. The man in the coat remained still, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent chills crawling down my spine. There was something familiar about him, something unsettling, like I had seen him before. But no matter how hard I tried to place him, I couldn't. His presence seemed to exist just beyond my memory, hovering at the edges of my consciousness. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I knew he wouldn't answer. The words felt hollow in the oppressive air. He didn't move, but the others behind him did. Slowly, methodically, they began to step forward, their dark silhouettes blending with the shadows as they approached. They were silent, but I could hear their footsteps. A rhythmic tapping, like the sound of nails on wood. With every step they took, the air around me grew heavier. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, and the sky above twisted more violently. The swirling colors, which had once been mesmerizing, now felt like a storm about to break. The atmosphere had become a pressure cooker, the weight of it threatening to crush me. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the street, my feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The world around me blurred, the shadows reaching out for me, as if they were alive, as if they were hunting me. I didn't know where I was going, or what I was running from. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many turns I took, the road never seemed to end. It was a labyrinth, a trap set to ensnare me. The buildings around me began to distort, their shapes twisting and bending as if they were made of some liquid substance. The windows were like black voids, staring back at me with hollow eyes. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder. They filled the air, reverberating off the walls, coming from everywhere. Some were indistinct, just a jumble of sounds, but others were clear. They spoke to me. "You can't escape. You're not supposed to be here. The box is waiting." I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head now, speaking in unison like a chorus of torment. I stumbled to a stop, my chest heaving. The road stretched endlessly before me, but in the distance, something caught my eye. It was faint, barely visible through the haze of shadows, but I could make out a figure. A woman, standing at the end of the street, bathed in a pale, flickering light. Something about her felt different. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong in this world of shadows and distortion. I started walking toward her, drawn by an invisible force. With every step, the whispers grew fainter, and the oppressive weight on my chest began to lift. It was as if she was the source of the brief calm, the thread that could lead me out of this nightmare. The closer I got, the clearer she became. Her features were soft, almost serene, but her eyes were dark, as if they contained the very fabric of the universe. She stared at me with an expression I couldn't place. There was a sense of recognition, but also something more, something unreadable. While I was only a few feet away, she spoke. "You shouldn't have opened it." Her voice was soft, but it carried an unshakable authority. It was as if the very air shifted when she spoke, the world bending to her words. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt the chill of their meaning settle deep into my bones. "The box was never meant for you," she continued, her gaze never leaving mine. "It chose you, yes, but it will take you if you're not careful. The path you're walking now, it's not just one of time, but of existence. Once you step onto it, there's no turning back." I could feel my heart race again. My thoughts were scattered, my mind scrambling to understand what she was saying. The box. The path. What did she mean? Why? I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might answer, but then her expression changed. It shifted, becoming more distant, more detached. "Because it is not just a box," she said, her voice now echoing as if it was coming from every direction at once. "It is a doorway, and you've walked through it. Now, it has begun to rewrite everything." She took a step back, her form beginning to fade, becoming translucent like a ghost. "You will need to find the center," she said, her voice growing fainter. "The heart of it all. And when you do, you'll know what to do." Before I could ask another question, she was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I stood there, alone in the street, with nothing but the hum of the box in my hand, vibrating ever so faintly. The voices had stopped. The air felt still, too still. The woman's words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't make sense of them. What center? What heart? What did it all mean? I had no answers. Only the path ahead, stretching out before me, and the feeling that whatever was coming, whatever was meant to happen, was already too far gone. I had crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. And now, I had to face whatever waited at the end of this journey. The street I stood on was empty now, silent, save for the distant hum that seemed to emanate from the box. It felt heavier in my hands, as though it were slowly becoming part of me. I wanted to put it down, to leave it behind, but something inside me resisted. Something told me that I needed it, that without it, I wouldn't be able to find the answers I was searching for. The shadows around me had deepened, swallowing up the last traces of daylight. The woman's warning echoed in my mind. "You will need to find the center." What did that mean? What was the center? I glanced around, trying to orient myself. The street was no longer the one I had been walking on before. It had twisted and changed while I wasn't paying attention. The buildings seemed to lean toward me, their forms unnatural, their windows reflecting nothing but blackness. It was as though I had stepped into a new reality, one that was darker, more oppressive. I took a deep breath and began to walk, but I had no idea where I was going. My mind raced with questions, each one more tangled than the last. The air around me felt thick, as if the atmosphere itself was growing heavier, more suffocating. The world seemed to shift beneath my feet, and with each step, the sense of something wrong, something impossible, grew. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling, and I was caught in the middle of it. I could still hear the faint murmurs of voices in the distance. They were indistinct, like whispers from another world, but they weren't as loud as before. It was as though they were retreating, pulling away from me, leaving me alone with the box and my thoughts. I turned a corner and came face to face with something I wasn't expecting. A door. It stood there, at the end of the alley, seemingly out of place. It was old, weathered, its wooden surface cracked and worn. A faint glow radiated from beneath it, casting an eerie light onto the ground. The hum from the box grew louder, more urgent, as if it recognized the door, as if it knew something I didn't. Without thinking, I approached the door and placed my hand on the handle. It was cold to the touch, and for a moment, I hesitated. What if this was the center the woman had spoken of? What if this door held the answers I needed? Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and stepped through. The world on the other side was wrong. There were no streets, no buildings, no familiar landmarks. Only a vast, endless void. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the only thing that seemed to exist in this place was the glowing light from the door behind me. I turned around, but the door was gone. Vanished, as though it had never existed at all. A wave of panic washed over me. I was trapped. There was no way back. And then I heard it. The voices, louder now, not in the distance, but right beside me. They weren't whispers anymore. They were clear, distinct. They were speaking directly to me. You shouldn't have come here. You cannot escape. This is where it ends. I spun around, looking for the source of the voices, but there was nothing. Only the void. The air was heavy with an unseen presence, pressing in on me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. You've opened the box, a voice said, one I didn't recognize. It sounded cold, mechanical, like it was coming from the very air around me. Now, you will see what it holds. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to shake. I fell to my knees, clutching the box tightly to my chest. The light from the box flickered, its glow dimming and brightening in rapid succession, as if the very essence of time was warping around it. And then, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowed, standing at the far edge of the void. It was impossible to make out its features, but I knew, deep in my gut, that it was the source of the disturbance. The very heart of this place. The figure began to move toward me, its form shifting with each step, blurring like smoke, and I could feel the pressure building. It was as though the very air was thickening, becoming harder to breathe. I stood up, backing away from the figure, but there was nowhere to go. It was closing in on me, its presence suffocating. You've opened the door, it said, its voice like the sound of thousands of voices speaking at once. Now, you will never leave. I raised the box in front of me, as though it could protect me. The glow of the box intensified, filling the void with blinding light. I could feel the energy from the box coursing through my body, connecting me to this strange world. The shadows around me recoiled, like they were afraid of the light. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me standing in the empty void. The light from the box slowly faded, and I was left in complete darkness. I didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been moments or hours. All I knew was that I was still here, trapped in this place, with the box in my hands and the voices in my mind. I didn't know what the box had done to me, or what it had shown me. But one thing was certain. The center, the heart of it all, had been revealed. And now, I had become part of it. Have you ever stayed somewhere that made you feel uneasy, like there was something just beyond the reach of your senses? It's a strange feeling, almost impossible to describe, but once you experience it, you never forget. That was the feeling I had when I checked into the old hotel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small, outdated building with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but something about it made me uncomfortable from the moment I stepped inside. The receptionist, an elderly woman with thick glasses and a warm smile, handed me a key without a word. She didn't need to say much. The hotel had an unspoken atmosphere, as though it didn't expect visitors and had long since given up on being anything more than a stopover for the weary and the lost. I didn't mind. I was only staying one night, just passing through, so I thought nothing more of it. But then I heard the first sound. It was faint, but unmistakable, a soft tapping, as if something, or someone, was moving just outside my room. I stood still for a moment, trying to place it. My room was on the 3rd floor, and I was the only guest there, or so I thought. I opened the door to the hallway, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty stretch of carpet leading to the stairs. I closed the door, locked it, and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. It was probably just the old building, I thought. No need to get worked up. As night settled in, the sound started again. At first, it was just a faint shuffle, like feet dragging across the floor, followed by the occasional soft cough or sigh. I told myself it was just the building settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It was around midnight when I first saw them. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hall. They were slow, deliberate, echoing in the otherwise silent building. My heart started to race as I quietly got out of bed and crept to the door, holding my breath. I opened the door a crack and peered into the hallway. There, at the far end, were two figures. They moved with a strange precision, walking in perfect synchrony, as if they had rehearsed their steps for hours. They didn't look at me, didn't seem to notice I was there at all. Their movements were almost mechanical, each step exactly the same as the one before. I closed the door quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. What were they doing? And why did they look so familiar? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen them before, though I couldn't remember where. The footsteps faded away, and the building settled back into its silence. I lay there, wide awake, unable to shake the image of those strange figures. Who were they? What were they doing? The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, something my mind had conjured up in the quiet of the night. But the unease lingered, hanging over me like a thick fog. I didn't see the figures again that day, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. There was something about their movements, the way they moved in perfect synchrony, that haunted me. That night, the tapping returned. It was softer this time, like a quiet knock at the door. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. The sounds grew louder, closer, and I could feel my heart rate spike again. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination. Yet, the more I tried to ignore it, the more real it felt. The door to my room creaked open. I hadn't heard anyone come in, but there they were, two figures, standing just inside the doorway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, staring at me with empty eyes. Their movements were the same as before, slow and precise. Step by step, they began to walk toward me. And then, they stopped. Their gaze never left me, but they didn't move. The silence was suffocating, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I wondered if I was dreaming or if something far more sinister was happening. And then, with a suddenness that made my heart leap into my throat, they turned around in perfect unison and left the room, walking in the same slow, deliberate pattern. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't sleep after that. The whole night was a blur of nervous energy, of listening for sounds in the dark, of wondering if they would come back. But they didn't. The next morning, I left the hotel as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to speak to the receptionist. I just packed my things and walked out the door, never looking back. I never saw the figures again. But there are nights, when I'm alone in my apartment, when I hear soft tapping in the distance. I know I shouldn't look, but sometimes I can't help it. And when I do, I swear I can see them, standing just beyond the doorway, waiting to come in. It's been weeks since I left the hotel, but the feeling never truly left me. There are nights when I close my eyes, and I can still hear the soft tap-tap of footsteps, that eerie rhythm of movement echoing in my mind. I've tried to ignore it, distract myself with work, meet up with friends, but it's always there, lurking in the background, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. It started innocently enough. I convinced myself that it was just the stress from the trip, the unfamiliarity of the place, my imagination running wild. That was the only explanation, right? But every now and then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, when I walked down the street, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those same figures following me, just out of sight, moving in perfect synchrony, their heads tilted slightly as if they were studying me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos from the trip. The ones I'd taken of the hotel, the lobby, the hallway, the worn-out furniture in the room, everything seemed normal. But then, as I scrolled to the photos I'd taken outside the hotel, something caught my eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. In one of the photos, I saw a figure standing in the background, just beyond the edge of the building. The figure was blurry, like a shadow, but there was something about its posture, too stiff, too deliberate. I zoomed in, heart pounding, hoping it was just a trick of the light or a flaw in the camera. But no! It was there. Standing motionless, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Could it have been one of the figures from the hotel? Was it possible they had followed me here, somehow? I checked the time on the photo, taken just before I left the hotel that night. It didn't make sense. How could they have been there, out of view, in a place I didn't remember seeing them? And then, something even stranger happened. I began to notice the same pattern repeating in my life. At first, it was small things, objects misplaced, a momentary flicker of light out of the corner of my eye, but then, as the days passed, the repetition became more apparent. I would walk into a room and see something exactly as I had left it, only to find it had changed the moment I looked away. A picture on the wall, slightly askew. A chair that was never in the same spot. It was as though the world was shifting around me, subtly, imperceptibly, until I couldn't tell if I had imagined it all or if something far more sinister was happening. The tapping returned. It was faint at first, just like before. A tap-tap on the walls of my apartment, on the ceiling, the floor. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just the building settling, the usual creaks of an old structure. But then it began to grow louder, more distinct, as if someone, or something, was moving just outside my door. I don't know how long I lay there, pretending to be asleep, listening to the sounds in the dark. The more I tried to block it out, the clearer the tapping became, almost like a rhythm, slow, deliberate. It was the same pattern, the same beat that haunted me from the hotel. I couldn't stand it any longer. I got up and went to the door, hand trembling as I turned the knob. I opened it slowly, half expecting to see one of the figures from the hotel standing in the hallway, their eyes locked on mine. But there was nothing. I stepped out into the empty hallway, my breath coming in short gasps. The building was silent. No footsteps, no voices. Just the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I turned back to my apartment, closing the door behind me. That's when I saw it, on the floor, just inside my room, a small, crumpled note. I picked it up, my heart racing. The handwriting was messy, hurried, almost frantic. It read, "They're coming. They're already here. They never leave. Watch the door." I looked around the room, my mind spinning. Who had written this? Who had been in my apartment? But more than that, the words, "they never leave," sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was the same feeling I had at the hotel, the same unsettling presence, the same sense of being watched. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The tapping, the figures, the repeating pattern, everything was connected. It wasn't just some bizarre coincidence. They were following me, watching me, and somehow they knew things they couldn't possibly know. They weren't just random strangers. They were something else. And now, it seemed, they were getting closer. It didn't stop after that night. In fact, things only got worse. The tapping continued, relentless and rhythmic, as if they were waiting for something. For me to do something, maybe. To acknowledge them, to accept their presence. I tried everything. I called the landlord, asking if there was any explanation for the sounds. The pipes, the building structure, maybe a pest problem. But every time, the answer was the same, nothing unusual. The building was quiet. No one else had reported anything like this. I began to doubt my sanity. The note haunted me. They never leave. The words echoed in my mind, gnawing at me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I didn't know what to do, so I did what I had always done when I was scared, tried to bury it. I tried to ignore the sounds, the feeling of being watched, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. I tried to go on with my day-to-day life, but it became harder with each passing hour. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, always lurking just out of sight. And then came the dreams. The dreams were vivid, almost like memories. I saw myself walking through that hotel again, through the empty hallways, but this time there was no one else. No receptionist, no guests. Just me, and the sound of footsteps, my footsteps echoing through the silence. And then, there they were. The figures. The same ones I had seen in the hotel. But now, they weren't just standing in the shadows. They were moving, gliding across the floor in perfect synchronization, their heads tilted in that same unnatural way. And every time I tried to look away, to turn and escape, they were there, closer than before. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sensation of their presence still heavy in the air. The silence was deafening, but it felt wrong, like something was waiting for me just beyond the edges of my consciousness. I looked around my room, half expecting them to be there. But nothing. Nothing except for the silence. Or was it? I turned to the window, glancing outside. The city was dark, the streets empty. But then I saw it, a figure standing across the street, watching me through the window. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the window, pulling the blinds aside, but when I looked, there was no one there. The figure was gone. But I knew it had been real. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, what had happened at that hotel, and why it was following me. I grabbed my phone and called the number from the hotel's website, the one I had used to make my reservation. It rang for what felt like an eternity, but when the voice on the other end answered, I barely recognized it. The voice was soft, familiar, but there was something off about it, something unsettling. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. The person on the other end hesitated, as if trying to place me. "Hello," they said, their voice cold. "How can I help you?" I stayed at your hotel. A while ago. Of course, yes. Room 309, was it? The voice was almost too calm. I froze. How did they know that? I hadn't mentioned the room number yet. Yes, I managed to say. That's right. Something strange happened while I was there. I need to know more about the guests, the ones who... They never leave, the voice interrupted, its tone shifting, growing colder. I froze, my stomach dropping. What do you mean? The voice was silent for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak. Then, it whispered, "They're not guests. There's something else. You shouldn't have stayed there." I was about to respond, to demand more answers, when the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my pulse racing. What did that mean? What had I just heard? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the tapping louder than ever. It was a steady rhythm, almost comforting in its consistency. But there was something different about it now. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps anymore. It was more like whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were there. I got up again, my hands trembling. I needed to see for myself. I walked out into the hallway, holding my breath. The building was as silent as ever, but the whispers were growing louder, echoing around me as if the walls themselves were speaking. And then I saw them again. In the distance, down the hall, I could see the figures, moving slowly, deliberately, as if they were waiting for me to approach. Their heads tilted at odd angles, their steps in perfect unison. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the figures, from the nightmare unfolding before me. And then, one of them looked up at me. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just a glance. It was a recognition. The figure knew me, as if it had been waiting for me to come closer. As if it knew what I had seen, what I had heard. I backed away, slowly, my heart racing, but the figure didn't move. It stayed there, staring at me, as the whispers grew louder and louder until they became indistinguishable from the beating of my own heart. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. The only thing I could do was watch. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of the figure's eyes. It felt as though it had imprinted itself on my mind, burned into my memory like a brand. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus, couldn't even leave my room. The hotel had become my prison, and every sound, every shadow, seemed like a threat. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was horribly wrong. The figure had been waiting for me, and I had no idea why. I spent the rest of the day trying to occupy myself, desperate for a sense of normalcy. I walked around the city, avoiding the hotel, trying to forget what had happened the night before. But no matter how far I walked, the shadows seemed to stretch after me, reminding me of what I had seen. The whispers never stopped. By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't ignore the pull of the hotel anymore. I felt like I had to go back. Like there was something I needed to finish, something I needed to understand. I returned to my room, heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked as I entered, the silence swallowing me whole. The hallway was empty, no tapping, no whispers. But I knew they were there, somewhere. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breath. I had to face this. I had to figure out what was happening. So, I took the only step I could think of. I decided to confront the figures. I made my way down the hall, the air thick with tension. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing closer with every step I took. My fingers curled around the railing as I descended the staircase, my stomach a knot of anxiety. At the bottom, the hallway stretched before me like an endless tunnel. The lights flickered above, casting long shadows along the floor. And then, I saw them. They were there, standing in the same place as before, their heads tilted at that unnatural angle. Their movements were mechanical, almost like a broken record skipping, repeating the same gestures over and over. I took a step closer, my body trembling. They didn't notice me. They couldn't see me. I reached the first figure, standing just in front of it. I stared into its eyes, empty, hollow, as though they weren't even human. It was like looking into a void. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something deeply wrong about this, something that I couldn't explain. And then, one of them moved. Slowly, almost deliberately, its hand reached out to touch me. I jumped back, heart racing. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. And then, everything changed. The figure that had reached for me tilted its head to the side, and the world around me began to distort. The hallway stretched out, bending like a funhouse mirror, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm. The figures were still moving, repeating their actions, but now they were different. More intense. I could hear them whispering now, their voices overlapping, indistinguishable from one another. It was as though they were saying the same things over and over, but with a sense of urgency. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I felt it, something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. Then, I heard it. A loud snap, like a door closing. And suddenly, everything stopped. The figures froze. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the hallway into darkness. I stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak. My heartbeat was the only sound I could hear, thundering in my chest. The silence was deafening. And then, I felt it, the cold, clammy breath against the back of my neck. I turned, but there was no one there. I spun back around to face the figures. They were still standing there, but now they weren't. The hallway seemed to stretch farther than it had before, as if the walls had moved away. I couldn't explain it, but I knew then this place wasn't just a hotel. It was something else. A place that existed outside of time, outside of reality itself. And somehow, I had become a part of it. I tried to step back, to retreat to the safety of my room, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, the air thick with an unnatural weight. The whispers began again, but this time they were clearer. They were speaking to me. "You shouldn't have come here," one voice said, its tone low and hollow. "You're not supposed to know," another whispered, its voice almost a hiss. I could feel the pressure building, the walls closing in around me, and yet I couldn't move. The figures had stopped moving, but their eyes, those dark, empty eyes, stared at me, as though they were trying to reach into my very soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but no sound came out. My breath was shallow, my pulse racing. I could feel the walls of the hallway shifting again, bending, as though they were alive. And then, it all became clear. The hallway wasn't just a hallway. It was a door between worlds. Between timelines, between realities. The figures, those strange, mechanical beings, were the keepers of this place, guardians of the thin veil that separated the ordinary world from whatever lay beyond. And I was trapped. As the realization hit me, I began to see it all, flashes of other versions of the hotel, other rooms, other people, other times. I saw myself, walking down the hallway, over and over again. But each time, the outcome was different. Sometimes I made it to my room. Sometimes I never reached the door. Sometimes I was gone, I had been here before. I had done this before. Each time, I had been pulled into the same loop, trapped in the same hotel with no way out. But this time, it was different. This time, I remembered. I remembered every time I had come to this place. Every time I had stepped through the door, not realizing that I was walking into a trap. And every time I had left, only to return again, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't know how long I had been here. Days? Weeks? Years? Time had no meaning in this place. And then, as I stood there, paralyzed by the overwhelming truth, the figures began to move again. This time, they weren't just repeating their actions. They were changing. Their movements were faster, more erratic. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "They know," one of them said. "They know everything." The others began to chant, their voices rising in unison, and I felt the world around me tremble. The walls shook, the floor buckled, and I felt the very foundation of reality crack beneath me. I had to escape. I had to get out before it was too late. In a blind panic, I turned and ran, not caring where I was going. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and warping as I sprinted through it. My breath was ragged, my body on fire, but the whispers were right behind me, following me, growing louder with each step. I couldn't escape. I couldn't outrun them. I could feel their presence closing in, wrapping around me like a vice. And then I heard it. A door. I had never seen it before, but it was there, right in front of me. The door was cracked open, a faint light spilling out from the gap. I could feel something pulling me toward it, something that whispered of freedom. Without thinking, I ran toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the handle, and as I touched it, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. I opened the door, and I was back. Back in my room. Back in the hotel. But something had changed. The walls were cracked. The furniture was broken. The air was stale, thick with dust and decay. The bed was empty, and the window was open, the night air rushing in. I stumbled back, my mind racing. It was over. I had escaped. Or had I? As I looked around, I saw it, the faintest outline of a figure in the corner of the room, standing motionless. It was watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. There was no escape. The loop had only just begun. And somewhere, out there in the hotel, the voices were waiting. Have you ever woken up and felt like the world around you is just a little bit wrong? Not in an obvious way, but in a subtle, creeping sort of way. That's how I started feeling about my life. I woke up every morning, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together who I was and what I had done the day before. It was never clear. I remember the first time it happened. I had gone to sleep like any other night, but when I woke up, something was different. My mind was a blank slate. No memories of the night, no trace of the events leading up to my sleep. I shook my head, trying to recall something, anything, but there was nothing. At first, I thought it was just a normal case of a restless night, but then the oddities started appearing. Little clues scattered around my apartment, things I couldn't have possibly done, but I knew, deep down, were connected to me. On the kitchen counter, there was a half-drunk cup of coffee, cold now, but still bearing the faintest impression of my fingers. I don't drink coffee. Never have. But there it was, unmistakable. On the couch, an empty pack of cigarettes lay beside an old notebook, the pages worn with time. I don't smoke, and that notebook wasn't mine. It had a name written in the corner, Elliot. Who was Elliot? I didn't know. I didn't even know how it got there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a strange coincidence, but the evidence kept piling up. Each morning, I woke with no memory of the night before, and each morning there were new signs that I wasn't alone in my own mind. As the days went on, the strange occurrences intensified. It was like I was living two lives, one while I was awake and one while I was asleep. But I wasn't in control of either. Every night, I would close my eyes, hoping that things would return to normal, and every morning, I'd find more fragments of a life I couldn't remember living. A letter appeared one morning, tucked under the front door. It was addressed to me, but I hadn't received any visitors the night before. It was just there. The handwriting was neat, too neat, and it read, "Tonight, you'll find the answers. But don't trust yourself." I didn't understand it. Who was writing to me? Why? And what did it mean, don't trust yourself? I had no choice but to follow the instructions. That night, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and waited for sleep to take me. But sleep, it seemed, was no longer my escape. It was my prison. The moment I fell asleep, I felt the shift, like I was slipping into another reality. But it wasn't peaceful. It was dark. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to move. When I woke up, the apartment was different, more disordered. The furniture had been shifted slightly, just enough to make the place feel off. And on the table, there was a small photograph of me and someone I didn't recognize. I wasn't smiling, and neither was the person in the photo. But we were sitting together, staring at something off frame. My heart pounded. I didn't remember this person. I didn't even remember taking the photo. The world felt wrong. Like the very fabric of reality had started unraveling, and I was helpless to stop it. But then it hit me. Each night, I woke up with no memory of the previous day. But I wasn't alone in the darkness. There was something else, something or someone leaving clues, guiding me through this maze of lost memories. And the more I discovered, the more I began to realize that these weren't just random events. These weren't accidents. Someone or something was tampering with my mind. My memories were being stolen, erased, and replaced with fragments of a life I didn't recognize. I was trapped. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I could ever escape. I didn't know who was doing this. I didn't know why. But I had to find out. I had to figure out what was happening before I lost everything. But every night, as I fell into a deep sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for me just beyond the veil of my dreams. I woke up again with the same emptiness. The same void in my mind that I could never quite fill. I looked around the room, searching for the pieces of my past, but the walls only stared back at me, as if mocking my helplessness. How many mornings had I woken up like this? How many times had I tried to make sense of the scattered fragments that appeared with each new dawn? The photograph from last night was still on the table, but now there was something new next to it, a small piece of paper folded neatly in half. I reached for it with trembling hands, my heart racing. Trust no one but yourself. The truth lies in your memories. If you don't fight, you'll never remember again. The words were cryptic, but they made something click in my brain. The truth, it was in my memories. But how could I trust them when they were slipping away with every night? When I couldn't even be sure of my own thoughts? I stood up, pacing the room, trying to calm my nerves. The silence was oppressive, and the stillness made me feel like the walls were closing in on me. My eyes darted to the clock on the wall, just a few minutes past 9 in the morning. I'd always been a morning person, but today, I felt like I was running out of time. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around, waiting for another piece of the puzzle to appear. I needed answers, and I had to find them before I lost myself completely. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. The sunlight outside seemed to mock me, so bright and ordinary, when everything inside me felt like it was unraveling. I stepped out into the hallway of my building, the familiar creaking of the old floorboards beneath my feet making the place feel even more foreign than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was a subtle sensation, like a whisper at the edge of my consciousness. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Just empty halls, bathed in the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights. I walked down the stairs and out onto the street, hoping that the fresh air would clear my mind. The city felt alive around me, bustling with people, but I felt like a ghost, disconnected from everything and everyone. I didn't know where I was going, but I walked anyway, letting my feet guide me. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty streets, a constant reminder of how alone I felt. I passed by familiar landmarks, coffee shops, stores, the park I used to visit often, but nothing looked the same. It was as though the world had shifted overnight, leaving me behind in its wake. And then I saw her. A woman standing at the corner, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was young, with dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. There was something about her, something in the way she stood there, unmoving, that made my heart skip a beat. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes locking with hers. She didn't smile or wave. She just looked at me. And in that moment, I felt something stir inside me, like a distant memory trying to break through the fog. I took a step closer, my body moving without thinking, drawn to her presence. "Do I know you?" I asked, my voice sounding weak, unsure. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started walking away, her footsteps light but purposeful. I hesitated, a chill creeping up my spine. Something was wrong. I knew it, but I couldn't explain why. I'd followed her. I don't know what I expected to find, but I knew I had to follow. I needed answers. As I rounded the corner, I found myself in an alleyway. The air was thick with the scent of garbage, and the walls were covered in old graffiti. The woman was still walking ahead of me, but she was moving faster now, her steps quickening with each passing moment. Suddenly, she stopped and turned to face me. Her eyes were wide, her expression frantic. "You need to stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Stop chasing the past. It's not worth it." I took a step back, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't understand." "You will," she said. "But you won't like it." Before I could ask anything else, she disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing there, alone and shaken. I didn't know what to make of the encounter. But as I walked back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside me had shifted, and I was no longer sure of what was real and what wasn't. As the night fell, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I had learned one thing: my memories were slipping away, but there was something else at play. Someone was manipulating me, pulling the strings, and I was too deep into it to turn back. The photograph, the letter, the woman in the alley, they were all pieces of a puzzle I didn't understand. But I couldn't stop searching for the answers. And I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something, or someone, was watching me, waiting for me to remember the truth. The next morning felt different, but in a way that only deepened the confusion. I woke up with the same sense of emptiness, but there was something else. A strange sense of déjà vu lingered in the air, like a memory I had already lost. I couldn't explain it, but it gnawed at me, just out of reach. I rolled over to glance at the table. The photograph was still there, but now it was accompanied by something new, another letter, the edges slightly crinkled as if it had been handled by someone else. My hand shook as I picked it up, almost as if it was expecting me. You're getting closer. But the deeper you go, the harder it will be to escape. Time is a trickster. Be careful who you trust. The answers are locked in the smallest moments, the ones you've already forgotten. My breath caught in my throat. The same cryptic tone, the same haunting advice. It felt like someone was taunting me, pulling me into a web I couldn't escape. But there was a pattern now, something I could recognize. The letters, the photographs, the cryptic messages, they all seemed to point to something greater. Something that was trying to pull me back into my own past. But I couldn't even remember my own past. Every morning, it was like I was waking up in a different version of my life, surrounded by reminders of a self I couldn't grasp. I sat up in bed, my mind racing. I had to know more. I couldn't wait any longer. The woman from the alleyway had said that I would learn something, but I wasn't sure I could trust her. There was too much at stake. I stood up and walked over to the window. The city outside was waking up, the streets bustling with life. It felt so normal. But I wasn't normal. None of this was normal. And then I saw it. Across the street, in the park where I had walked countless times before, a man was sitting on a bench. He was facing away from me, but something about him caught my attention. He was too still, too deliberate in his posture. It was like he was waiting for me. I felt my heart race, my mind reeling. Could he be another piece of the puzzle? Another part of whatever game was being played with me? I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something, that he had answers I needed. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out of the apartment, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. As I descended the stairs, I could feel the weight of the air around me, thick with unease. I pushed open the door, the cool breeze hitting my face, and walked toward the park. Each step felt like a choice. A decision to dive deeper into whatever was happening, knowing that the more I searched, the more I risked losing everything. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let go. Not yet. When I reached the park, I saw that the man was still sitting there, as if he had been waiting for me all along. I approached cautiously, trying to read him from a distance. But his face was hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out hat. All I could see were his hands, clasped together in his lap, his fingers twitching slightly. As I got closer, he turned his head just enough for me to see his eyes, cold, empty eyes, like windows to a place I couldn't reach. "You've been looking for answers," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But the more you look, the more you lose." I stopped in my tracks, my mind racing. How did he know? How do you? I began, but he raised a hand, cutting me off. "You won't remember." "Not everything," he said. "But the important things, those you'll never forget." if you can survive the forgetting. I swallowed hard. His words felt like a warning, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. It was like he was speaking in riddles, twisting my thoughts into knots I couldn't untangle. I need to understand, I said, my voice shaking. I have to know what's happening to me. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You think you can stop it, but you're too far gone. It's already started. And soon, there will be nothing left to hold on to. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if every step was part of a carefully planned sequence. Wait! I called out, but he didn't respond. He simply walked away, fading into the crowd, as if he had never been there at all. I stood frozen, my thoughts spiraling. Was he telling the truth? Was I already lost? I wanted to run after him, to demand more answers, but I knew that wouldn't work. He had already slipped away into the fabric of the city, like a shadow I couldn't catch. I turned and walked back toward my apartment, my heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. I had to figure this out. I had to find a way to stop the cycle before it consumed me completely. But with each passing moment, I felt more and more disconnected from the world around me. The memories were slipping through my fingers like sand, and soon there would be nothing left but the echoes of a life I no longer recognized. The next few days blurred into one another, each day indistinguishable from the last. I was stuck in a cycle I couldn't escape, a loop of forgotten mornings and unsettling reminders. The more I searched for answers, the less I felt like myself. Each time I woke up, it was as if I was someone else, a stranger inhabiting my own body, walking through a life that wasn't mine. Yet, there were always signs that something had happened the night before, something I wasn't supposed to remember. The photographs, the notes, the objects left behind. But each time I tried to hold on to them, they slipped through my fingers. The apartment felt colder, more distant. Even the walls seemed to whisper, as though they were hiding something I couldn't see. I avoided mirrors now, afraid that the face I would find would be someone I no longer recognized. That morning, when I woke up, I found a new object on the table. It was an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, the spine creased as if it had been opened many times. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I didn't know where it had come from, but I could feel the weight of its contents pressing against my chest. Inside, the first page was covered in unfamiliar handwriting. I was you, once. And now I am gone. But you will find me, if you dare to look. The truth is waiting. My pulse quickened. The handwriting, there was something so familiar about it. It was mine, but it wasn't mine. It was like a ghost of myself, haunting the pages. But how could this be? How could something so personal appear in my apartment, in my life, when I couldn't remember writing it? I turned the page, desperate to understand, but the words on the next page were different. They were fragmented, broken thoughts that didn't seem to connect. Last night, I saw him again. The man with the eyes that see everything. He knows. He knows what's happening. I tried to escape, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked from the inside. I froze. The man. The one I had seen in the park. Was he real? Or was this just another piece of the puzzle? I couldn't be sure. But something about the way the journal described him made my blood run cold. It was as if the journal had been written by the version of me from a different night, a me who had tried to understand, but failed. I skimmed through the rest of the journal, my hands shaking. The entries grew more frantic with each page. The writing became almost illegible, as if the writer was losing their grip on reality. The last entry was barely a sentence. I've forgotten. I've lost it all. The trap is set. It's already too late. I closed the journal and set it down, my mind racing. I had to confront the man. The one who seemed to know everything, the one who had warned me. But I wasn't sure where to find him or what to ask. The journal had only raised more questions. And each new question felt like another step closer to losing myself entirely. I walked to the window and looked out over the city. The streets were as busy as ever, people rushing to their destinations, unaware of the strange nightmare I was living. But for me, the world felt wrong. Everything felt off. I couldn't trust my own memories, and I couldn't trust the world around me. I had to find the man. I had to learn the truth, no matter the cost. I left the apartment and walked through the city, my footsteps quick and purposeful. I felt like I was being pulled in a direction I couldn't explain, like something or someone was guiding me toward an inevitable confrontation. I reached the park again, the place where everything had started. But this time, the man wasn't there. The bench was empty, the park quiet and still. I stood there for a moment, scanning the area. There were people walking by, but none of them seemed familiar. And then I saw it, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the shadow of a tree, its branches swaying in the wind. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the man had been here just moments ago, but now he had vanished again, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That someone, or something, was always just out of sight, waiting for me to make my next move. Waiting for me to unravel the mystery of my own existence. I left the park and made my way back to the apartment. As I approached the door, I felt a strange sense of finality. Like something was waiting for me inside. I opened the door slowly, and the apartment felt colder than before. I stepped inside, and immediately, I noticed something was different. The journal was gone. I scanned the room frantically, my heart racing. The table was empty. The photographs, the notes, everything was gone. As if it had never existed. And then I heard it, the soft whisper of footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Only the silence of the apartment pressing in on me like a weight. I had crossed a line, I realized. The trap had been set. And now, there was no going back. The silence of the apartment was deafening. My breath felt shallow as I stood frozen, my eyes darting across the room. The familiar surroundings now seemed alien, warped, as though they had been molded into something unrecognizable. My hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as if I were afraid the world would slip away if I let go. I knew I had to leave. I had to escape before whatever this was consumed me entirely. But the door was locked. I approached it slowly, hesitating before I turned the handle. It was no use. The lock was stuck, frozen, like the rest of the apartment, caught in a loop. The air around me felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I turned back to the room, trying to steady my thoughts, but the sound came again, a faint tapping from somewhere deep within the apartment. It was subtle at first, but then it grew louder, more insistent, as if it were echoing from all directions at once. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tapping was rhythmic, methodical. Like someone, something, was trying to make its presence known. I walked toward the sound, every step bringing me closer to the unknown source. My mind screamed for me to turn back, to ignore the call. But I couldn't. I rounded the corner into the hallway, my steps faltering as I approached the bedroom. The door was ajar, just slightly, like an invitation to cross into something darker. I hesitated, but only for a moment. The tapping had stopped, replaced by something else. A whisper. "Come closer." The voice was familiar. It was mine, but twisted, distorted. I felt my pulse quicken as I pushed the door open fully. Inside, the room was different. The furniture was shifted, the walls seemed to stretch outward as if trying to swallow me whole. And there, sitting on the bed, was me. Not the version of me I remembered, but another one. The man from the journal, the one who had written those frantic entries. His eyes locked onto mine with a knowing look, as if he had been waiting for this moment. For me to finally come to the truth. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I felt trapped in my own body, as if something was holding me still, suffocating the words before they could escape. The other me smiled, a sad, almost pitying expression. He stood up slowly and walked toward me, the floorboards creaking under his weight. I could feel his presence, heavy, oppressive. He was the echo of the man I had been, the version of me that had lost everything. "Do you remember?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper now. "Do you remember what happened?" I shook my head, desperate to understand. The memories were slipping through my fingers, like sand in the wind. Each time I reached for them, they vanished, leaving me with only the fragments of a past I couldn't piece together. "You were supposed to remember," he said softly. "But it's too late now. The trap is set. We were never meant to escape." I stepped back, fear rising in my chest as the room seemed to close in on me. His words twisted around me like vines, tightening with each breath I took. "This is the end," he whispered. "The cycle continues. You will wake up again tomorrow, and none of this will have ever happened. But I will always be here. I will always be you." I wanted to scream, to fight against the words, but they consumed me, wrapping around my mind until I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. And then, everything went black. I woke up the next morning, in my bed, as if nothing had changed. But the silence was different this time. There were no photographs, no notes, no clues left behind. Only the quiet hum of the world outside. I got up, walking to the window. The city was alive, just like before, its streets crowded with people, all going about their lives, unaware of the nightmare I had just lived. But I knew that I was still trapped. The memories were gone, erased again by the morning light. And somewhere, deep inside me, I felt the weight of it all, the knowledge that I would never escape this loop. I turned away from the window and looked at the door. It was unlocked now. It had always been unlocked. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. Because no matter where I went, no matter what I did, I would always be there. The other me would always be waiting. Watching. Waiting for me to forget again. And I would. I would forget. Just like always. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, uncertain if you were still dreaming or if something truly happened? I have, countless times. And every time, it's the same. The whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind. You know how it is, old houses have a way of creaking and groaning in the night, their wood and walls shifting with the temperature. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the mind. But then, as the nights went by, the whisper grew clearer, louder, more insistent. It started with the sound of soft murmurs, like a conversation just beyond the edge of my hearing. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining to make out the words, but they always seemed to fade when I tried to focus on them. The whispers were like an itch I couldn't scratch, a presence I couldn't place. It wasn't until the third night that I decided to do something about it. I couldn't sleep, the sound was maddening. I slipped out of bed, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. The apartment was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. The whispers were coming from behind the bedroom door. I crept toward it, my hand resting on the doorknob. The sound was clearer now, almost as if someone was standing just on the other side of the door, speaking directly to me. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know. I had to see who or what was behind that door. I turned the knob slowly, the creak of the door breaking the stillness of the night. The room beyond was empty. No one was there. Just the same quiet bedroom I had left behind. I stepped inside, scanning the corners of the room, searching for any signs of a presence. But there was nothing. The whisper had stopped. I stood there for a moment, confused, my mind racing. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? I closed the door behind me and returned to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. But as I lay there, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that lingered, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was closer. It seemed to come from inside my own mind, like a voice that wasn't mine, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my body tense up, every muscle on edge. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. The whisper was real. And it was coming for me. I couldn't sleep that night, not even after the whisper faded. I stayed awake, my ears straining for any sound, any movement, but it never came. Just silence. Deep, oppressive silence. As the days passed, I tried to forget about it. I convinced myself that it was just stress, or exhaustion, or maybe even something I hate. But each night, as the darkness descended and the quiet of the apartment settled in, I could feel it, like a shadow hovering at the edge of my mind. And then, one evening, I heard it again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. A call. A plea. Come closer, the voice said. The words were so clear, so distinct, as though the speaker was standing right next to me. I could feel the coldness of the voice seep into my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to answer. But it felt like the voice was pulling me, drawing me in. Against my will, I stood up and approached the door once more. My hand reached for the knob, my fingers trembling. I opened the door. The room was empty. But something was different. There, on the floor in the middle of the room, was a small, folded piece of paper. I bent down, my heart pounding in my chest, and picked it up. It was blank, save for a single word scrawled across the surface. Now. I dropped the paper, my breath catching in my throat. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a presence I couldn't understand. I backed away from the door, my mind racing, my thoughts spinning out of control. The whisper was getting louder, more urgent, as if it were pushing me towards something I didn't want to face. I slammed the door shut, my chest heaving as I collapsed onto the bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the silence to return, for the whispers to stop. But they didn't. The whisper was in my head now, and it wasn't going away. That night, I didn't sleep. The whispers were there, persistent, suffocating. I could feel them crawling under my skin, making my thoughts blur and twist into something unrecognizable. I couldn't think straight anymore. I needed to figure out what was happening, what was behind that door. But part of me was terrified to know. I paced the room, my mind racing. Every time I turned my back to the door, I could swear I heard something moving. The soft scrape of fabric across wood, the faintest echo of footsteps on the other side. But when I turned to look, the room was always still, the door closed, nothing out of place. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever was on the other side, even if I didn't want to. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and clutched it like a weapon. My hand was shaking, my breath ragged. I couldn't hear the whispers now, but I knew they were there, just beneath the surface, waiting for me to listen. I stood in front of the door for a long moment, my mind spinning in circles. Then, I turned the handle and opened it again. The room was exactly as I had left it, empty, silent. But the air felt thicker now, like something was pressing in from all sides. I stepped inside, my heart thudding in my chest. The room was colder than before, the temperature dropping as though the walls themselves were breathing in the dark. And then, I saw it. On the floor, near the bed, was another note. This one wasn't blank. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, as if it had been written in a hurry. The words were simple, but they sent a chill down my spine. You're not alone. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I wanted to run. I wanted to lock the door and pretend this was all just a nightmare, but I couldn't. Something about this felt so real, too real to ignore. The whispers were back now, louder than ever. They were no longer outside my head, but inside it, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. They were distant at first, but as I stood there, they grew closer. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing right behind me. I spun around, the lamp raised, but there was no one there. I could hear the whispers, but they weren't just in my ears anymore. They were in my mind, twisting my thoughts, pulling at something deep inside me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the voices only grew louder. I tried to step back toward the door, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place, as if the floor had become a tar pit, sucking me in. I heard the voice again, clear and unmistakable, like it was right next to my ear. Come closer to the truth. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The whispers weren't just words anymore. They were like a force, a presence, pressing down on me, pulling me into the darkness. And then, in a moment of panic, I bolted for the door. I threw it open and ran back to the safety of my bedroom, slamming it shut behind me. I collapsed onto the bed, gasping for breath, my mind spinning in a chaotic whirl of fear and confusion. The whispers were still there, faint now, but always present, lurking in the corners of my mind. I didn't know what was happening to me. I didn't know what that thing wanted, or why it was coming for me. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone. And I wasn't sure if I ever would be again. The next day, the whispers didn't stop. They were quieter now, like an almost imperceptible hum that buzzed in my head. But they were still there, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't think. I couldn't focus. I tried to go about my day, work, eating, trying to act normal, but I felt like I was living in a fog, disconnected from everything around me. By the time night came, I was already on edge. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to let me rest. I hadn't dared to open the door again. I couldn't. I knew the moment I did, the whispers would return, and I wasn't sure I could handle that again. I thought maybe if I stayed awake, I could escape it, but my body betrayed me. My eyelids grew heavy, and no matter how hard I fought it, sleep came creeping in, slowly, like a tide pulling me under. When I woke up, it was the same. The room was dark, the air thick and still, but there was something else. Something subtle, like a weight pressing against my chest. I sat up quickly, panic rising in my throat, but I didn't hear the whispers. At least not at first. Then, I saw it. The door was open. I hadn't opened it. I was sure of that. I hadn't even come near it. And yet, it was standing wide open, a dark void where the room beyond should have been. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge it, but my body moved of its own accord, drawn like a moth to the flame. I got out of bed, my legs shaking beneath me. My heart was racing, thumping in my chest like it might burst. As I approached the door, I felt an icy chill wrap around me, curling under my skin. It felt wrong. It felt like something was waiting, something just beyond the threshold. But nothing was there. I stepped inside, my breath shallow, the air thick with dread. The room was exactly as it had been before, empty, untouched. Yet, there was a presence, something heavy and unseen. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't see anything out of place. Then, I heard it again. The whisper. Soft, but clear, as if it was coming from inside my skull. You shouldn't have come back. I froze, my body rigid with terror. It was the same voice. The same presence. But it was different now, closer, more urgent. I turned around, expecting to see something, anything. But again, there was nothing. Except the note. It was on the floor again, just like before, but this time it was different. The handwriting was the same, but the words were different. You're not meant to be here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever, or whatever, was sending these messages knew something I didn't. Knew something I wasn't supposed to know. I knelt down to pick it up, my hand trembling, and as I did, I felt it. A cold finger brushed against my neck, sending a jolt of terror through my entire body. I jerked back, but no one was there. I stood up quickly, heart hammering in my chest, but I didn't leave. I couldn't leave. There was something compelling me to stay, something that wouldn't let me run, not until I understood what was happening. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were in the room, swirling around me, echoing off the walls. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, insistent, demanding, as though something was trying to communicate, something that wasn't human. The coldness in the room deepened, and then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps, my entire body trembling from the sudden shift in atmosphere. My head spun with confusion, but deep down, I knew. I knew that I was no longer alone in this space. That thing, the voice, the presence, it was here with me now, and it wasn't going to leave. I turned to leave the room, but as I did, the door slammed shut behind me with an ear-splitting crack. I spun around, heart racing. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my ears with their chaotic murmurs. But then, a single word stood out from the rest. Stay. My legs felt weak, my body heavy as if it had been drained of all its strength. Something was pulling me back toward the door, urging me to open it again. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But the pull was too strong. I reached out, my hand trembling as it grasped the cold door handle, and before I could think, I opened it. The door creaked open, but what I saw beyond it wasn't what I had expected. The room wasn't the same. It was darker, the walls seemed to stretch farther than they should, and the air felt thick with the weight of something unseen. The familiar space of my bedroom had disappeared, replaced by a shadowy version of itself. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The whispers returned immediately, louder now, pressing in from all sides. It was like the very room itself was alive, humming with the voices of hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. But there was something off about them, something wrong in the way they layered over one another, distorted and frantic. I couldn't breathe. The air felt so cold, like it was seeping into my lungs, freezing me from the inside out. My hands shook, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, prickling in response to an unnatural presence. Then, a voice broke through the cacophony. Not a whisper, but a clear, sharp command. Come in. The voice was unmistakable, and my heart skipped a beat. It was mine. It was a cruel mockery of my own voice, twisted into something sinister. My body was no longer under my control, my legs moving forward despite the terror that surged through me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my mouth wouldn't open. My body was moving as though it had a mind of its own, drawn into the room I didn't recognize. The door slammed shut behind me, and the room shifted once again. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe like living creatures, crawling across the walls and ceiling. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, desperately trying to find an escape. But there was no escape. I turned to see a figure standing in the corner of the room, half hidden in the darkness. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and calculating. The air grew even colder, and I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but no sound came out. I could still hear the whispers, louder now, echoing in my mind, but the words were incoherent. They were like fragments of thoughts, half-formed and twisted. And then, I felt it. A hand. Cold and clammy, it brushed against my shoulder, sending a jolt of icy fear through me. I spun around, but no one was there. Nothing but the oppressive darkness. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was circling me, getting closer. I was trapped. There was no escape from this nightmare. The whispers grew frantic, more urgent. They were coming from everywhere, surrounding me, drowning me in their endless mutterings. And then, in the midst of the chaos, one word stood out again. Stay. It wasn't just a command anymore. It was a plea. A desperate, pleading cry that seemed to come from deep within the very walls of the room. I felt my chest tighten, my heart thudding in my ears as I fought to regain control of my body. But the whispers, they were everywhere. I couldn't tell if they were inside my head or outside, but they were suffocating me, pulling at my very thoughts. And then I saw it. The figure in the corner moved. It was slow at first, a shifting blur in the darkness, but it was moving toward me, closer with each passing second. It had no shape, no clear form, just a mass of shadows and tendrils that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly, two bright spots in the darkness, and they were locked on me. Don't run, it said, its voice echoing in my mind. You can't escape. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, my voice lost in the chaos of the whispers. The shadows closed in, crawling along the floor, reaching for me, pulling me toward them. My feet were no longer on the ground. It felt as though the floor was disappearing beneath me, and the walls were closing in, shrinking around me like a trap. I reached out, desperate to break free, but there was no way out. The door was gone, swallowed by the dark, and all that was left was the suffocating blackness and the whispers that would never let me go. I closed my eyes, trembling, and for a moment, I thought I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me, crushing me into the very floor. And then, there was silence. The whispers, the shadows, they were gone. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. But when I opened my eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was back. And the note was there again, lying on the floor just beyond the threshold. It was my handwriting. But it was not my hand that had written it. You never left. I didn't dare touch the note. I knew that to reach for it, to let my fingers graze its surface, would mean crossing a line I wasn't prepared to face. The air was thick, like something unseen was watching me, waiting. Every inch of the room felt wrong, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, leaving a hollow, empty echo in its wake. I stepped back from the door, the whispering in my head growing louder once more, but this time it wasn't a jumble of incoherent sounds. No. This time it was a single phrase that repeated over and over. Come in. I didn't want to listen, but it was like the words were pulling me, tugging on my thoughts, forcing me closer to the door. Something inside me screamed to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as though every instinct, every sense of survival had been overridden by something far more powerful. A force beyond my control. I knew now that it wasn't just a room that was wrong. It was me. There had been no escape from the moment I first heard that whisper at the door. The thing behind it had followed me, tracing my every step, tightening its grip with every passing night. I glanced back at the note, still lying there on the floor. The handwriting was perfect, unmistakable, it was mine. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't really me who had written it. It was a version of me that didn't belong in this reality, a reflection that had been distorted, a puppet controlled by something far darker than I could comprehend. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, walking toward the door, though every step felt like wading through thick mud. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't stop now. I had to face whatever this was. Whatever had been waiting for me. As I reached for the doorknob, the whispers surged again, louder than ever. The room seemed to pulse with each word, each voice twisting and stretching like it was alive. The tension was unbearable, but I couldn't turn back now. I opened the door. The world beyond it was the same, yet entirely different. It felt like I had stepped into another dimension, one that mirrored my own but was distorted by the weight of 1,000 forgotten dreams. The floor beneath me was cold, the walls stretched high above, and the air was thick with the same oppressive silence I had felt earlier. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the figure. It was the same shadowy mass I had seen before, but now it had form. It had shape. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, though his features were warped, his face twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched far too wide. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, glowing faintly like twin lanterns in a sea of black. You shouldn't have come, it said in that same voice, my voice. But this time, there was no mistaking it. This was no illusion. This was real. I stepped back, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. My thoughts were fractured, splintering apart as the creature before me moved closer. I could feel it now, the truth of what it was. It wasn't just a manifestation. It was part of me, part of the version of myself I had been running from, the part that had been trapped here, in this twisted realm, pulling the strings. "I've been waiting," it whispered, its voice echoing in the chamber. "You never left." "Not really." I looked down at my hands, my body trembling. The shadows around me shifted, as though they were alive, and I understood in that moment that everything I had experienced, all the whispers, the changes in the room, it was all a trap. A trap for my memories, for my soul. I was part of this place now, just as it was part of me. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and for a moment I wanted to scream. But no sound came. There was no escaping the truth that had been hidden from me for so long. "You were never meant to remember," it said softly, the smile stretching impossibly wide. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its eyes, empty, hollow, yet somehow filled with understanding. Understanding of everything I had never known. And then, silence. The whispers stopped. The door closed behind me. I was no longer in control. Have you ever walked into a building and suddenly found yourself in a place that shouldn't be there? A place that wasn't on the map, a floor that didn't exist? That's exactly what happened to me one evening after a long day at work. I had stayed later than usual, the only sound in the office being the hum of the lights and the tapping of my keyboard. It was a typical office building, one of those nondescript high-rises in the middle of the city. The kind of place you never think twice about entering. But that night, as I stepped off the elevator, something felt off. I had pressed the button for my usual floor, the 15th, but the elevator opened on a different level, a floor I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe I pressed the wrong button. But when the doors slid open, the space inside was wrong. It was dimly lit, a far cry from the bright, sterile lighting I was used to on the other floors. The air was heavier, the atmosphere unnerving. I hesitated before stepping out. The hallway was empty, silent, but it was the silence that made my skin crawl. Everything looked familiar, yet unfamiliar at the same time. There were doors on either side, just like the other floors, but this place had a strange aura, a forgotten quality. Like no one had been here in years. I took a few steps forward, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. There was a desk near the end of the hallway. I made my way towards it, intrigued but nervous. As I got closer, I saw a few papers scattered on the desk, documents. I reached out, and a chill ran down my spine. I recognized the papers. They had my name on them. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the papers, unable to move. How could they have my name? I hadn't been on this floor before, and yet here they were, documents that seemed to be written specifically for me. My heart raced in my chest as I reached down and picked one up. It was a report. About me. I skimmed the words quickly, but they made no sense. It was as if someone had written a summary of my life, events that I didn't remember happening, details that I had never known. I felt a cold sweat on my brow. Something wasn't right. I quickly dropped the papers, backing away from the desk. I had to leave. The strange feeling in my gut was growing stronger by the second. I rushed to the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. The doors opened, and I stepped inside, my mind reeling with confusion. As the elevator descended, I glanced back toward the hallway. The floor number read 15. But when the doors opened, I was back on the ground floor, just as I should have been. I walked out of the building, my heart still pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to that floor, to the desk with my name on those papers. It didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that I was just tired. But something deep inside me told me that I hadn't imagined it. The place was real. And the next day, when I went back to the building to find that floor again, it was gone. The elevator no longer opened to that floor. I asked the building staff about it, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They assured me that all the floors in the building were accounted for. No floor was missing. But I knew what I had seen. And now, I had to know the truth. What was that floor? What was the meaning of the papers? And why had I been drawn to it in the first place? It started as any other workday. The usual hum of the office building, the soft clack of keyboards, and the low murmur of voices filled the air as I made my way through the lobby. The building was a standard office space, nothing special about it, really. But that morning, something felt different. A strange unease settled in my chest, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I was tasked with retrieving some documents from a colleague on the 13th floor. I took the elevator, which always seemed a little too slow, like it was reluctant to carry people to the heights they desired. The ding of the elevator door opening was always a relief, but on this day, it seemed unusually hollow. The 13th floor was quiet, and I didn't mind the peace. It had been a long week, and I was looking forward to a few minutes of solitude as I picked up the files. But as I walked down the familiar hallway toward my colleague's office, something caught my eye. There, at the far end of the floor, was a door I'd never noticed before. It wasn't like the other offices or storage rooms. This door was heavier, older, almost as if it had been placed there after the building was finished. The wood was dark, the handle worn, and the number above it was blank. No signs. No labels. Just a door, standing ominously against the wall. Curiosity tugged at me, and I moved toward it, each step sounding too loud in the otherwise silent hallway. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the handle, unsure if I should open it. There was no reason to be cautious, no reason to think that anything was wrong. Yet, my mind couldn't help but race with questions. Why was this door here? And why didn't I know about it? I pushed the door open with a creak, expecting to see a supply closet or an empty office. What I found, however, was something much more unsettling. The room was large, the walls lined with dusty file cabinets and long-forgotten furniture. There were no lights on, but the dim light filtering in from the hallway was enough to make out the shapes inside. What was strange wasn't just the appearance of the room, but the undeniable feeling that I had stepped into a space that didn't belong. I walked further into the room, and my eyes were immediately drawn to the cluttered desks. Papers were scattered across the tops of every desk, files, folders, random documents, but what made my heart skip a beat were the names written on some of them. There, on one of the papers, was my name written in the same bold black ink I used when I signed reports. I moved closer, my breath catching in my throat. How could this be? I had never been here before. I knew every floor of this building, and yet I had never seen this room, this floor, this place. I moved from desk to desk, my fingers grazing over the papers, trying to make sense of the situation. There were notes about meetings I had never attended, reminders about tasks I didn't recognize, and one document that made my stomach twist. It was a note from my boss, instructing me to complete an urgent report by the end of the day. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was just before noon. but something felt wrong, off. I had to get out of here, and fast. As I turned to leave, I noticed something even more disturbing. The door I had entered through was no longer visible. The hallway, the elevator, the familiar surroundings of the office building, they were gone. In their place was an endless stretch of darkness. I blinked, unsure of what was happening. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this a prank? Some elaborate hoax set up by the office to mess with me? Or was something far more sinister happening? I walked toward where the door should have been, my steps heavy and uncertain. Each movement felt wrong, like the air around me was thicker, heavier. As I reached the spot where the door had been, I was met with only blank walls. There was no sign of the room, no trace of the floor I had just been on. I was alone. Panicking, I rushed to the elevator. My fingers fumbled with the buttons, pressing each one in turn, but nothing happened. The elevator remained motionless, silent as a tomb. Suddenly, a thought struck me, and I imagined the whole thing. Could it be that the stress of work had finally taken its toll on me, pushing me into some kind of strange, delusional state? But then I remembered the papers. The ones with my name on them. And the feeling in that room, the unmistakable sense that I wasn't alone. I had to go back. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if something truly unexplainable had happened. The elevator dinged. The doors opened to the same floor I had entered from, and I stepped inside, my heart still racing. As I made my way back to my desk, everything seemed normal again. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and the hum of office conversation filled the air. No one seemed to notice the anxiety in my eyes, the panic still gripping my chest. I returned to my desk, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that clung to me like a second skin. It wasn't until later that day, when I walked past the elevator, that I saw the sign by the door. The one I had missed earlier. The one that should have been there, the one I would have sworn had been blank. It read, Floor 13, Restricted Access. The sign was impossible to miss now. It stood there like a warning, its words staring back at me in cold, undeniable certainty, Floor 13, Restricted Access. I couldn't stop thinking about it as I stood in front of the elevator, the hum of the building's machinery surrounding me. For a moment, I questioned whether I had simply overlooked it earlier, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. The sign hadn't been there before. I took a deep breath and stepped into the elevator. The soft chime of the doors closing sounded unusually loud in the silence of the hall. As the elevator ascended, the floor numbers clicked by one. 10, 11, 12. And then, when it should have gone to 13, the elevator stopped. I felt a chill spread over me. It wasn't the cold air or the sense of unease. No, it was the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. The elevator didn't move. No sound came from the machine. It was as though the entire building had paused for just a moment. My pulse quickened as I pressed the button for the 13th floor again. Nothing. I tried every button, my hands shaking with the increasing sense of dread. The elevator seemed to mock me, standing still, refusing to budge. Was it broken? Was I stuck in some strange limbo between floors? It wasn't like any elevator I had ever experienced. It felt as if the building itself was trying to prevent me from reaching that floor. With a deep breath, I exited the elevator. The hallway was eerily quiet. I knew something was about to happen. I could feel it in my bones. Despite the rational part of my mind trying to convince me that this was all just an odd coincidence, my gut told me I needed to investigate. I walked down the corridor of the 12th floor, past offices that seemed perfectly normal, people typing away at their desks, phones ringing in the distance. Everything was the same as it had always been, except for the nagging sense of the unknown clawing at my mind. And then, in the very back corner of the hallway, there it was again, the door. It hadn't been there before. I would have noticed it. And yet, here it was now, just as I remembered it, old, worn, the number blank above it, like a page torn out of a book. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment I had been dreading. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was behind that door. With a trembling hand, I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, its sound almost too loud in the silence of the building. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the same unsettling atmosphere, dusty furniture, old filing cabinets, and those papers scattered across the desks. But there was something different this time. Something new. On the desk at the far end of the room, I saw a familiar face, mine. A picture of me, taken just a few days ago, was taped to one of the papers. My stomach twisted. How could this be? I hadn't been here yesterday. I hadn't left a picture of myself in this room. There was no way. But the most disturbing thing was the note attached to the photo. It was a reminder to myself. Don't forget. You're in danger. My blood ran cold. I didn't remember writing that, but I couldn't deny that it was my handwriting. I turned the note over, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain this strange, terrifying experience. But all I found was more of the same, a trail of questions with no answers. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. The door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the empty room, and I spun around, my heart racing. I expected to see someone who had been watching me, someone who knew what was going on, but there was nothing. Just darkness. The lights flickered, and the room seemed to stretch out before me, the shadows growing longer with each passing second. My breathing grew shallow as I turned toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. But when I touched it, the door refused to open. I pulled harder, my pulse pounding in my ears, but it was as if the door was locked from the other side. My fear escalated, and my mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening. Was this all in my head? Was I trapped in some nightmare? I stepped back, trying to steady myself, but my foot caught on something on the floor. Looking down, I saw a stack of papers with my name on them. I bent down to pick them up, and as I did, I noticed something else, something that made my heart stop. The papers were dated for tomorrow. My mind reeled. How could that be? How could I have papers dated for a day that hadn't even happened yet? Was I being haunted by some kind of time loop, or was this some elaborate setup? The feeling of being caught in a web that I couldn't escape from was overwhelming. And then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible at first. It was coming from behind me, from the darkness at the far end of the room. Leave, now! I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, still, as if nothing had changed. Yet, that voice lingered in my mind, a warning I couldn't ignore. I ran to the door again, pulling desperately, but still it wouldn't budge. My panic mounted, and I slammed my body against it, my fists pounding against the cold wood. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to reality. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the door opened. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The air outside felt thick, suffocating. The lights on the floor flickered for a moment, and then, with a deafening silence, they went out. The building was plunged into darkness. I couldn't believe what I had just experienced. The floor, the room, it was all real, but so impossible. I had to get answers, but I wasn't sure if I was even prepared for what I might find. As I stood there in the pitch-black hallway, the words from the note echoed in my mind, "Don't forget. You're in danger." Would I be able to uncover the truth, or had I already crossed a line from which there was no return? The next morning, I tried to shake off what had happened, convincing myself it was some kind of dream. The events from last night, the strange door, the photographs, the voice, felt too surreal, too impossible. But as I walked through the office, the normality of the day only served to heighten the sense of dread that lingered in the pit of my stomach. I tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that the 13th floor, the floor that shouldn't exist, had occupied my thoughts every minute since. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head, how the door had slammed shut, how the papers had been dated for tomorrow. Everything felt wrong, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't control. Mid-morning, I received a call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. "You need to stop looking," the voice said, its tone flat, emotionless. "You're not supposed to know." My heart skipped a beat. It sounded like someone I knew, someone close to me, but I couldn't tell who. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, just the sound of the line going dead. I sat frozen for a moment, my mind racing with thoughts of who could be behind the call. Was it a warning? A threat? Or just another piece of this twisted puzzle? I felt my hands begin to shake as I held the phone tightly, as though it were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I had to go back. I had to find that floor again, find the answers. I couldn't let this go. That evening, as the office emptied out and the building grew quieter, I made my decision. I would go back to the elevator. The floor had to be real, even if it seemed impossible. I had seen it. I had been there. And I had to know what it meant. As I stepped into the elevator, the sense of foreboding washed over me. The soft hum of the machine was almost soothing in its familiarity, but the stillness of the building had a weight to it now, as if it were waiting for something. The elevator ascended slowly, the familiar numbers flickering above the door, 10, 11, 12, and then, just as I had expected, the elevator stopped. Floor 13. The doors opened with a soft whoosh, and I stepped out, my heart racing in my chest. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit, quiet. But the feeling was different this time. There was no sign of the strange door, no indication that anything was wrong. The space felt cold, sterile, empty in a way that made my skin crawl. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The offices were the same as they had been, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the end of the hallway, where the door had been. It was gone. Panic surged through me. The room. The floor, it had all disappeared again, like a ghost fading from existence. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A piece of paper crumpled on the floor just outside one of the offices. I picked it up, and my pulse quickened as I read the words scrawled across it in my handwriting. "They will find out." I didn't understand. Who was they? What was happening? I tried to steady my hands, but they trembled as I held the paper. The last thing I wanted was to dive deeper into whatever this was, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned to leave the hallway, but then I heard it, the soft, distant sound of footsteps behind me. slowly at first, then louder. Closer. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, still, silent. My heart raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just beyond my reach, watching me, waiting. Then, as I stood frozen in place, I felt a presence, something dark and malevolent, settle in the air around me. The temperature dropped, the cold creeping into my bones. The whisper of something, someone, filled my ears. You shouldn't have come back. I turned again, hoping to see an exit, hoping for something familiar. But the hallway stretched on, a maze of dark corridors that seemed to shift and twist in unnatural ways. The walls were closing in, and the sense of being trapped was overwhelming. The lights flickered, and then, as if the building itself was rejecting my presence, the air grew thick with tension. The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, as though the floor, the building, the very place I was standing, had become a sentient being, and it did not want me here. The footsteps stopped. The whispering faded. I was alone again, but the silence felt like a warning. I rushed back to the elevator, desperate to escape. My fingers slammed the button for the ground floor, but the elevator remained motionless, its doors closed, as if frozen in time. My breath came in shallow gasps, and panic began to rise. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of the unknown, or the terrifying certainty that I wasn't alone. Just as I thought I might lose my mind, the elevator jolted to life. The doors opened, and I stepped inside, pressing the ground floor button once more. The elevator descended, slowly, as if the building itself didn't want to let me go. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out, my knees weak and my heart still racing. I glanced back at the elevator, but the door was already closing. I was safe, at least for now. But something had changed. The events of the past 24 hours had shattered my sense of reality. I was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. And as I made my way to the exit, one thought echoed in my mind: would I ever be able to escape the vanished floor? The next few days passed in a haze, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me, suffocating me with questions. Every corner of the office seemed to hold a secret, every shadow felt like a reminder that something was out of place. The fear gnawed at me constantly, and I could hardly focus on anything other than the vanished floor. I kept asking myself, was I losing my mind? Was there a logical explanation, something I hadn't considered? But the more I tried to convince myself that it was all just some sort of mistake, the more the unease settled in my bones. I felt as though I was being drawn into something much darker, something I couldn't escape. I had gone back to the building several times since that night, but every time, the 13th floor was gone. The elevator refused to stop there. I had tried to press the button over and over again, but it simply wouldn't respond. The building, it seemed, was denying the floor's existence. And yet, I couldn't shake the image of the papers, those documents with my name still etched in my memory. On the third day after the incident, as I sat at my desk, I received another call. This time, the voice on the other end was clear, cold, and unmistakably familiar. I warned you to stop looking, the voice said, its tone full of authority. It was my boss, Richard. But there was something off about the way he spoke, something distant in his words. He didn't sound concerned or angry, he sounded resigned, as if he had expected me to do exactly what I had done. I don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. What do you mean? You've seen the floor, haven't you? He asked, as though he already knew the answer. It's not meant to be found. And you should have left it alone. A chill ran through me. How could he know about the 13th floor? And why did he sound so cold? There was an eerie finality in his words, and I could hear the faint echo of something that sounded like fear in his voice. I don't know what's happening, but I have to know more. What is this place? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Richard was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his words were barely audible, as though he was speaking from far away. Get out. Leave now, before it's too late. The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and my heart raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was this some kind of warning? A threat? Or was it a last-ditch effort to prevent me from uncovering something that no one was supposed to know? The call was a confirmation. Something sinister was going on, something beyond my understanding. And I was dangerously close to uncovering it. That night, after the office had emptied and the building was nearly silent, I made up my mind. I had to go back. I couldn't let this go. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the answers I was looking for weren't going to come to me willingly. I had to find them, no matter what it took. The elevator ride was just as unnerving as the first time. I pressed the button for the 13th floor, my finger hovering over the button for what felt like an eternity before it finally clicked. The doors closed, and the elevator began its slow ascent. I was prepared for the floor to be gone again, but when the elevator reached its destination, the doors opened. The floor was there. But something was different. The hallways were darker, the air thick with a sense of dread that hadn't been there before. The faint flickering of the lights added to the oppressive atmosphere, and the silence was so complete that it felt suffocating. I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The walls seemed to close in on me as I moved deeper into the space, the sense of being watched growing stronger with every step. At the end of the hallway, I saw the door. The same door I had seen before, the one that led to the room I had found. But this time, there was something new. The door was slightly ajar, as though inviting me in. I hesitated. Something was wrong. But I couldn't turn back now. I pushed the door open, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was exactly as I remembered, but the tables were no longer empty. Documents were scattered across them, all bearing my name. But these were different. They were marked with strange symbols and cryptic messages. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was impossible. The words seemed to blur together, shifting as though they were alive, moving just beyond my comprehension. Then I saw it, a photograph, resting on one of the tables. It was a picture of me, taken from behind, standing in the very hallway I was in now. The photo was dated for tomorrow. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. How was this possible? How could they know? How could they be predicting my every move? And then, from behind me, I heard it again. The whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was a voice, a soft, insistent murmur that seemed to come from all around me, seeping into my mind like a poison. You shouldn't have come back. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as though the very walls were closing in on me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it was a deafening roar in my ears, drowning out everything else. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but the hallway outside had changed. The walls were warping, shifting in ways they shouldn't have been able to. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. I pulled on the handle again and again, but the door remained locked, as though the building itself was keeping me in. In that moment, I understood. The floor wasn't just a place, it was a trap. And I was caught in it. The more I tried to escape, the more it twisted and turned, pulling me deeper into its web. I was never meant to find this place. I was never meant to leave. I slammed my fist against the door, panic surging through me. The walls of the hallway were now undulating like the surface of a disturbed pond, warping and shifting in ways that defied logic. The whispering, the sound of it, so close now, so invasive, drowned out everything else. It was as if the very air around me was alive, suffocating me with its presence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was spiraling, overwhelmed by the horror of being trapped. The whispers were all around me now. Every corner of the room, every crack in the wall seemed to carry a voice, my own thoughts, but twisted, distorted, as though they had been altered by someone else. You shouldn't have come back. I recognized it now. The voice, the same one that had warned me on the phone, the one that had spoken to me in my dreams. It was mine, but it wasn't. It was deeper, darker, more malevolent. It was the voice of someone who had already been here, someone who had lived this nightmare before. And I realized, horrifyingly, that it wasn't just my voice I was hearing. It was a chorus. It was all the versions of me, all the versions of myself that had stepped onto this floor and never left. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the warped walls. The whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't just in my head anymore, they were all around me, echoing, surrounding me, filling the air with a buzzing, sickening chant. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my body frozen in place by some invisible force. The room had become alive with memories, alive with versions of myself that I had never lived, never experienced. I reached out for the table, hoping for something to steady myself, but the documents, the photographs, all of it, they were changing. The symbols on the papers were shifting, rearranging themselves into new forms, new words that seemed to reach out toward me. You're not meant to be here. The voice, now directly in my ear, was unmistakable. The floor, it wasn't just a physical space. It was a place that existed outside of time, a place where moments repeated themselves, where people, me included, were caught in loops they couldn't escape. I looked at the photograph of myself again, the one taken from behind, the one that showed me standing in this very hallway. The date was the same, but the time was wrong. It wasn't today, or tomorrow, it was a day that hadn't yet come. And then it clicked. The floor, this place, wasn't just disappearing. It was existing outside of time, existing in multiple realities. It appeared when it wanted to. It took people when it wanted to. It changed memories, altered events, trapped them in an endless cycle. And I had been part of that cycle all along. I understood then what had happened to the others, the ones who had disappeared before me. They hadn't left, they'd just become part of the floor, part of its twisted loop. Their memories were now scattered among the papers, among the photographs, among the symbols. They were all here, in this place, caught in the same never-ending moment. And I was about to join them. I reached for the door handle again, desperate to escape. But this time, the door opened. I stepped through, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway stretched out before me, just as it had been before, just as it had always been. But now, I knew the truth. There was no escape. I turned to look back, but the door had disappeared. The elevator, 2 was nowhere to be found. The building, this place, was never going to let me go. In that moment, I understood that the floor wasn't just some anomaly. It was a prison. A place where time unraveled and trapped people in its twisted grasp. And I had become its newest prisoner. The whispers, those voices, grew louder and louder, surrounding me, filling my mind with thoughts that were not my own. I was already becoming one of them. One of the lost, one of the forgotten. A name, my name, echoed in the distance. But it was distant now, fading into the endless maze of voices. And then, everything went black. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.